Here's the thing about being just curious enough to ruin your life. It sneaks up on you. One minute you're having a normal Thursday, eating leftover pizza in bed, and the next, you're climbing into the dumbwaiter in your apartment building because you heard a noise coming from inside it. Let me rewind. I live in an old, slightly creepy building that was probably fancy 100 years ago, but is now mostly peeling wallpaper, rattling pipes, and weird stains no one talks about. My neighbor, Mrs. Schultz, swears the building's haunted. But then again, she also swears she saw Elvis working at the Walgreens down the street. So when I heard the thump 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 coming from the hallway dumbwaiter at midnight, I figured it was probably rats, or a raccoon, or something else I didn't want to think about. But the noise didn't stop. It just kept going, thump thump thud, like something heavy was being dragged around inside. After 15 minutes, I couldn't ignore it. My sleep-deprived brain whispered, what if it's not rats? What if it's something interesting? And like an absolute idiot, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The dumbwaiter sat at the end of the hallway, its little wooden door about 3 feet tall with a brass handle that looked like it hadn't been polished since Prohibition. I crouched down, flashlight in one hand, and tugged the door open. It creaked loudly. Of course it did. And inside was the dumbwaiter's lift, complete with its tiny rope pulley system and a space just big enough for a small adult. Me. I shined the flashlight into the shaft, half expecting to see a rat army looking up at me. But it wasn't rats. It was a ladder. The walls of the shaft were old brick, and attached to the side was a narrow, rusty ladder leading down into the darkness. The thumping sound had stopped, replaced by silence. The creepy kind. The something is waiting kind. I should have closed the door and gone back to bed. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. But instead, I sighed dramatically, stuffed the flashlight into my hoodie pocket, and climbed into the dumbwaiter. To be clear, it was not built for climbing. The wood groaned under my weight, and for a second, I imagined falling straight through and becoming a ghost story for the next tenant. But I didn't. I grabbed the sides, leaned into the shaft, and lowered my foot onto the top rung of the ladder. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not a normal basement cold. A deep, creeping cold, like the air was being sucked out of the walls. I climbed down carefully, rung by rung, counting in my head to distract myself. 10 rungs, 15 rungs, 30 rungs. This didn't make sense. I knew the building had a basement, but I'd been climbing down for at least 3 stories. Finally, my foot hit solid ground. I shined the flashlight around and immediately regretted it. I was standing in a massive underground room, a room that should not have existed. The walls were made of stone, smooth and black, and they curved up into a vaulted ceiling like some ancient cathedral. The air was heavy, thick with dust, and scattered across the floor were broken objects. Old typewriters, cracked plates, suitcases spilling yellowed papers. I stepped over what looked like an antique rocking horse and tried not to wonder who, or what, had been using it. At the center of the room, there was a table, and on the table sat a single object, a small, black box. The box was no bigger than a shoebox, perfectly square, with no hinges or seams. Just a little brass keyhole in the center. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, which felt like a bad omen, but I ignored it. The box looked out of place. Too clean, too deliberate, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Okay, I said aloud to no one, because talking to yourself is what you do when you're 2 seconds from losing it. This is stupid. I should go. And yet, I couldn't stop staring at the box. Before I knew what I was doing, I reached out and touched it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the box clicked. The keyhole turned on its own with a sound that echoed through the room, loud enough to make me jump back. Then the box started humming. It was a low, vibrating sound that buzzed up through my shoes, rattling my bones like a struck tuning fork. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at the box as it cracked open along its edges. What came out wasn't a light, or smoke, or anything you'd expect. It was a voice. "Hello, Arden." I swallowed hard. Hi." The voice was calm and silky, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Thank you for finding me." "Yeah, sure," I said, because apparently sarcasm is my defense mechanism when I'm scared out of my mind. What exactly did I find? The voice chuckled, and I hated how it made the room seem smaller. I am choice. I am escape. I am the answer to every question you've ever asked. That's vague and ominous, I muttered. Open me, the voice said. I stared at the box, its lid now half open, and felt something pulling at me. Not physically, mentally. Like it was reaching into the back of my mind, poking at my thoughts. Open me, it repeated, softer this time, and all you desire will be yours. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is where it got tempting. Because who doesn't have desires? I thought about my life. The bills stacking up, the job I hated, the weird sense that I was meant for something more. What if the box could give me all of that? But then I noticed something. On the floor beside the table, almost hidden in the shadows, was a shoe. Just one. A man's dress shoe, old and dusty, like it had been there for years. And beside it, a pair of broken glasses. My chest tightened. I looked back at the box. What's the catch? I whispered. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the box hummed louder. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer. It felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide. I don't know how I knew, but I did. Whatever was in that box wasn't offering me salvation. It was hungry. I took a shaky step back. No. The voice didn't laugh this time. It screamed. Not like a person, like 1,000 voices all shrieking in unison. The sound ricocheted off the walls, and the box snapped shut with a force that shook the floor. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the dumbwaiter, climbing the ladder so fast my hands burned. When I finally reached the top, I tumbled into the hallway, slammed the dumbwaiter door shut, and crawled back to my apartment, locking every bolt behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear it. The humming. Faint, but there. Like the box is still waiting, still calling. I haven't gone near the dumbwaiter since, but if you ever hear something strange inside your walls, I suggest you ignore it. Some doors and boxes are better left closed. It was raining the night the man knocked on my door. Not the soft, misty kind of rain that makes you want to curl up under a blanket, but the kind of rain that pounds against the windows like it's trying to get inside. I was home alone, eating leftover pizza and watching reruns of some reality show I wasn't proud of. The knock startled me. It was firm and deliberate, 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:38 p.m. No one comes knocking that late unless they're lost, drunk, or trying to sell you something you don't want. My apartment isn't exactly in a friendly part of town. I didn't get up. I figured they'd knock once more and give up. They didn't. The knocking came again. Exactly the same. 3 knocks. It was almost polite, which somehow made it worse. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone if things got weird, and crept toward the door. I peeked through the peephole, and there he was. The man. He looked like he'd stepped out of a black and white movie. His suit was old-fashioned, dark and tailored, and he wore a bowler hat, tilted just so. His face was pale, too pale, like it hadn't seen sunlight in decades, and his eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of his hat's brim. He didn't move, just stood there, waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. I should have ignored him. I should have turned around, locked the door tighter, and gone back to my pizza and reality TV. But I didn't. I cracked the door open, just an inch. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound annoyed instead of uneasy. The man's head tilted slightly, like he was surprised I'd answered. "May I come in?" he said. His voice was soft and deep, almost melodic, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl, like the words were practiced. "No," I said quickly. "Sorry, I don't let strangers in." The corner of his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course. Wise." He paused, his hands still clasped behind him. "But you invited me, didn't you?" I froze. "What?" The man leaned forward just slightly, his face still hidden in shadow. "You invited me. When you left the window open." My blood ran cold. My window. My bedroom window, which I'd cracked open earlier because the heat in my apartment was unbearable. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart hammering in my chest. I raced to my bedroom, already knowing what I'd find. The window was wide open now, rain blowing in and soaking the carpet. I shut it, locked it tight, and backed away, breathing hard. My mind was spinning. How did he know about the window? Had he been inside? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my thumb shaking against the screen. But when I pressed call, there was no dial tone, just silence. And then, knock, knock, knock. I turned slowly. The sound was coming from the bedroom closet. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate, like my brain had pulled the emergency brake. The knocks came again, softer this time, almost like they were teasing me. I forced myself to step closer, holding my phone like it might somehow protect me. The closet door was closed, but I could see the light bulb inside. One of those old pull-string lights, flickering beneath the crack at the bottom of the door. I hadn't turned that light on. I reached for the closet doorknob with a hand that didn't feel like my own. The knob was ice cold, so cold it burned my skin. I pulled it open. The closet was empty. The light bulb inside flickered once and went out. I stared into the darkness, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I felt it, just behind me. A presence, close enough that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. "May I come in?" the voice whispered, right at my ear. I spun around, but the room was empty. The knocking started again, this time from the front door. It was faster now, more insistent. I ran back to the living room, desperate to see if the man was still there. I pressed my face to the peephole, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't on the doorstep anymore. He was inside. Not in the hallway. Not outside the building. Inside the peephole. His face filled the tiny circular lens, staring back at me with eyes that were no longer hidden. They were black. Not just dark, but void. Like twin holes punched into the fabric of reality. And they were looking straight at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and hitting the floor hard. I scrambled to my feet, every instinct in my body screaming at me to get out. I grabbed my keys and yanked the front door open, bolting down the hallway without looking back. I spent the night in my car, parked in a gas station lot 2 miles away. I didn't go back to the apartment until the next morning, when the sun was high, and even then, I made sure I wasn't alone. My friend, Dave, came with me. I told him I thought someone had broken in, that maybe I'd had a panic attack or a weird dream. But the truth was I just couldn't face it alone. When we got to the apartment, everything was normal. No water on the carpet. No flickering lights. The window was locked, just like I'd left it. Dave joked that I needed to lay off the late-night horror movies, and I laughed along, pretending he was right. But as I cleaned up the apartment, I found something. Sitting neatly on the coffee table was a bowler hat. It was dry, like it had never been touched by the rain. I threw the hat away that day, stuffed it deep into the dumpster behind the building, and locked every window twice. But I still hear it sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. Knock, knock, knock. And when I look at the peephole, I don't check it head-on anymore. I glance at it sideways, from the corner of my eye. Because one of these nights, I know he'll be there, waiting. And the next time, I'm afraid I'll let him in. The clock in Evelyn's apartment struck midnight, its soft chime barely audible over the storm outside. Rain hammered against the windows, drowning out the city's usual hum of life. She sat curled on her couch, a mug of untouched tea in her hands, staring at the peculiar object that had arrived on her doorstep that morning. A key. It wasn't just any key. The metal was black, almost obsidian-like, with an intricate pattern of etchings that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. It was heavier than it should have been, and when she had tried to dismiss it as some random prank, her neighbor swore no one had been outside her door that day. A small tag dangled from the key's neck, tied with a thread so thin it looked like spider silk. On the tag, written in sharp, precise lettering, was a single word, "Tonight." At first, Evelyn had planned to toss it away, but something about it whispered to her, an unshakable pull, like it had been made for her and her alone. So now she sat, waiting, though for what, she didn't know. At exactly 12:12 a.m., the power went out. The hum of her fridge ceased, the overhead light extinguished, and her apartment was plunged into darkness. Evelyn froze, the mug trembling in her hands. The storm outside seemed louder now, the the thunder rolling so close it rattled her windows. And then, she heard it. Click. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. It came from her bedroom. A deliberate, mechanical click, like the turning of a lock. Evelyn stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't own anything with a lock. Slowly, she set the mug down on the coffee table and crept toward the hallway, her bare feet silent against the floor. The door to her bedroom was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the dark hallway. That was impossible. She turned the lights off in there before sitting down. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. She stepped closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. The light spilling from her bedroom was strange. Not the warm yellow glow of her bedside lamp, but pale and cold, like moonlight reflected on water. She pushed the door open. Her room wasn't there anymore. Instead, she was looking into a narrow hallway made of stone, its walls slick with moss and damp. The air that seeped through the doorway was icy, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of iron. The light came from lanterns mounted along the walls, their flames dancing unnaturally, as though caught in an invisible breeze. Evelyn stepped back, her breath catching. This couldn't be real. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but the stone hallway remained, stretching far into the distance, impossibly long. And at the end of it, a door. It was massive, carved from dark wood, its surface etched with swirling patterns that matched the ones on the key. The key. She glanced down and realized she was holding it, though she didn't remember picking it up. The metal was warm against her palm, as though it had been waiting for this moment. "Nope," Evelyn whispered to herself, turning back toward the living room. But the hallway wasn't behind her. The couch, the storm, her apartment, all gone. Stone walls surrounded her now, the air thick and heavy, muffling even the sound of her breathing. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. Her voice echoed down the hallway, distorted, as if the stones themselves were swallowing her words. There was no answer. With no other choice, she walked forward, each step hesitant. The lantern light flickered as she moved, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The hallway seemed to curve slightly, pulling her toward the door at the end. As she got closer, she noticed the patterns carved into the door more clearly. They weren't just swirls, they were eyes. Hundreds of them, staring, unblinking, each one different. Some were human, others reptilian, others too alien to describe. They seemed to follow her movements, shifting subtly as she approached. The key in her hand pulsed, warm and insistent. Evelyn hesitated, her hand hovering over the door's handle. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, but her body ignored the command. Slowly, she inserted the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft creak. Beyond it was a room that defied logic. It was vast, impossibly so, like a cathedral carved into the bones of the earth. The walls shimmered with a faint iridescence, shifting colors like oil on water. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat a small, glass orb, glowing faintly from within. Evelyn stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her. The air in the room buzzed with energy, raising the hairs on her arms. As she approached the pedestal, she felt the pull again. Stronger now, like gravity bending her toward the orb. Her hand reached out almost involuntarily, her fingers brushing the glass. The moment she touched it, the room changed. The walls dissolved, replaced by a swirling void of stars and galaxies. Evelyn was floating now, her feet no longer touching the ground, her body weightless. The orb in her hands pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and as she stared into it, images began to form. She saw herself, but not as she was. In one vision, she was older, standing atop a mountain, her hands raised as lightning crackled around her. In another, she was cloaked in shadow, her eyes glowing with an eerie blue light as she walked through a city in flames. The orb showed her countless versions of herself, powerful, broken, kind, cruel. Each one felt real, as though they were fragments of something greater. "You are the key," a voice whispered. It wasn't hers, but it came from within her, resonating in her chest. "The choice is yours. Will you open the door, or close it forever?" The void pulsed around her, waiting. Evelyn tightened her grip on the orb, her mind racing. She didn't know what the voice meant, but she could feel the weight of its truth. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and made her choice. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The storm had passed. The key was gone, but on her nightstand sat the glowing orb, its light faint but steady, and she knew, deep down, that the doors weren't done with her yet. The day I accidentally became a professional ghost hunter started with a simple text from my cousin Sophie. "Hey, are you still into weird stuff? Need your help with something spooky at my friend's Airbnb." Now, let's be clear, my weird stuff phase peaked in middle school when I dabbled in urban legends and kept a notebook of questionable Bigfoot sightings. But Sophie didn't need to know that. I was bored, my weekend was wide open, and the idea of investigating something spooky sounded like the perfect mix of ridiculous and fun. So, I threw on a jacket, grabbed an old flashlight for effect, and headed to the address she sent me. The Airbnb was a massive Victorian house with peeling paint and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. It was the kind of place that could be used as the setting for a low-budget horror film, right down to the overgrown yard and creaky iron gate. Sophie greeted me at the door, wide-eyed and dramatic as ever. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, like I was a seasoned exorcist she'd summoned from the yellow pages. "All right," I said, trying to look professional while adjusting the flashlight in my pocket. "What are we dealing with? Poltergeist? Possessed toaster? Creepy doll that moves on its own?" Sophie rolled her eyes. "It's not funny. Weird stuff's been happening all week. Lights flickering, doors slamming, footsteps in the hall when no one's there. And last night," she shivered, "someone, or something, wrote 'Get Out' in the steam on the bathroom mirror." "Classic ghost behavior," I said, nodding solemnly. "Did you try asking it nicely to leave?" She ignored me and led me inside, where her friend Carla was sitting on the couch, looking about as pale as the faded wallpaper behind her. Carla explained that she bought the house as a charming fixer-upper, but decided to rent it out on Airbnb after realizing how much actual fixing it needed. The trouble started when her last guest, some YouTuber doing a haunted stay challenge, left a scathing review claiming the house was definitely cursed and possibly trying to kill him. Since then, Carla said, no one's been able to last more than a night here. I don't know if it's a prank or if there's really something here. She glanced nervously at the shadowy staircase behind me. I leaned back, crossing my arms like I knew what I was doing. "All right, let's check it out. Show me the mirror." The bathroom was small, with a clawfoot tub and one of those ancient sinks that looks like it's seen things it can never unsee. Sophie pointed at the mirror, which was fogged up from the hot water she'd run to replicate the ghostly message. Sure enough, faint letters had appeared. "Get out" in jagged, uneven strokes. Creepy, I admitted. I leaned in, squinting at the writing like I was Sherlock Holmes. "Do you think it's ghost handwriting? Ghosts have handwriting?" Sophie asked. "I don't know, but this one has terrible penmanship," I muttered, wiping the mirror clean. "Let's keep investigating." We moved through the house, checking out the flickering lights, a faulty circuit breaker, the slamming doors, drafty hinges, and the footsteps, probably creaky floorboards, though Sophie insisted she could hear a distinct ghost cadence. By the time we got to the attic, I was feeling pretty confident that the haunting was just an unfortunate combination of bad wiring and overactive imaginations. And then we heard the noise. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere above us. Sophie froze. Carla grabbed my arm like I was a human shield. "Did you hear that?" Sophie hissed. Yep," I said, trying to sound calm while my brain screamed, "What was that?" We stood there, staring at the attic door. Another sound came, a faint rustling, like something or someone was moving around up there. "You have got to be kidding me," I muttered. "Ghosts," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide. "It's probably squirrels," I whispered back, though my voice lacked conviction. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the attic door open, revealing a steep wooden staircase. A cold draft swept down, carrying the faint scent of mildew and regret. "Okay," I said, mostly to myself. "Let's solve this mystery. Have fun," Sophie said, promptly shoving me forward. I climbed the stairs, every creak of the wood sounding like a warning. The attic was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, casting long shadows across piles of forgotten junk. Dusty trunks, cobwebbed furniture, and a truly disturbing number of porcelain dolls. I scanned the room with my flashlight, half expecting a raccoon to jump out at me. Instead, I saw something worse. A figure. It was small and vaguely human-shaped, hunched in the corner, swaying slightly. My heart stopped. My brain screamed run, but my legs were frozen in place. "Who's there?" I croaked, raising the flashlight like it was a weapon. The figure turned, slowly, and that's when I saw it. Two glassy eyes, a cracked porcelain face, and the unmistakable grimace of a mannequin. "Oh, come on," I yelled, my fear instantly replaced by outrage. I stormed over to the mannequin, which had been rigged to a pulley system that made it sway when the attic door opened. Classic Scooby-Doo trap. As I inspected the setup, a small cassette player hidden behind the mannequin began to emit that same guttural moan. I pressed stop and turned to the doorway, where Sophie and Carla were cautiously peeking in. "It's not a ghost," I announced, holding up the cassette player. "It's amateur theatrics." "But who would do this?" Carla asked, looking genuinely baffled. Just then, I noticed a small logo on the mannequin's base. The Haunted Stay Experience Company. "It's your YouTuber," I said. "He didn't just stay here. He staged the haunting, probably to drum up views." Carla's face darkened, her fear replaced by righteous fury. "He's paying for the new wiring," she muttered, stomping downstairs to call her lawyer. Sophie and I stayed behind, surveying the attic like we'd just cracked the case of the century. "So, not ghosts?" Sophie asked. "No ghosts," I said. "But maybe next time?" "Sure," I said, rolling my eyes. "Next time, we'll find a real ghost." And that's how I accidentally got roped into starting a ghost hunting business with Sophie. Turns out, there's a surprising demand for skeptics who can debunk haunted items. We've even got a name now, Phantom Logic Investigations. Do I believe in ghosts? Not really. But after spending enough time in creepy old houses, I've learned one thing. Whether it's faulty wiring, pranksters, or actual spirits, every haunting has a story, and sometimes those stories are worth chasing. What's the weirdest mystery you've ever stumbled into? I woke up to find that everything I owned had decided to quit. My bed, once cozy and loyal, had untangled itself into a pile of boards and springs, leaving me sprawled on the floor. My blanket had slithered away overnight, curling into a nest under my desk, where it now snored softly. The dresser had packed up its drawers and shoved itself into the corner like a moody teenager. Even my alarm clock had rolled itself off the nightstand and smashed in what I can only assume was an act of defiance. "Can we talk about this?" I asked the room. No response, except for a low hum from the ceiling fan that sounded suspiciously judgmental. I got to my feet, bones creaking, and stepped over the rogue bed springs to get dressed. My shirt gave a little sigh when I picked it up, like it was only tolerating me out of pity. "Oh, come on," I muttered. "It's not that bad here." The shirt said nothing, of course, but I swear it felt heavier than usual, as though it were dragging its proverbial feet. In the hallway, I discovered the walls had begun peeling themselves like they wanted out, too. The wallpaper curled inward, revealing layers of strange, faded colors underneath. Deep emerald greens, mustard yellows, shades that didn't belong to this house. One of the curls had formed a spiral, and when I leaned in close, I could swear it was moving, spinning ever so slightly, pulling at the edges of my vision. "Don't look too long," said the coat rack, which had grown a little mouth near its base. "You'll get stuck." I blinked at it, then looked back at the wallpaper, which had stopped moving. Where did that come from? "It's always been there," the coat rack replied with the distinct air of someone who knows a secret but isn't about to share it. I didn't bother arguing. By this point, I knew better than to question furniture. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, where the appliances were staging some kind of sit-in. The toaster had flipped itself upside down. The coffee maker refused to acknowledge me, and the refrigerator had pushed itself against the back door as if it were barricading us inside. "Really?" I said to the fridge. This is childish. I'm full, it said flatly, voice rumbling from somewhere deep within. I'm not working today. Fine, I muttered, grabbing an apple off the counter. It rolled itself out of my hand, bounced once, and scurried under the couch like a frightened mouse. Unbelievable. Outside, things weren't any better. The sky was upside down, with the clouds drifting lazily along the ground like fog while the grass seemed to stretch endlessly into the air, growing taller with each passing second. A crow flew past. Only it wasn't a crow but a newspaper folded neatly into the shape of a bird. The pages flapped, rustling headlines I couldn't quite make out, before it banked sharply and disappeared into the sky. I sat down on the front step, where the concrete was unusually warm, and tried to make sense of it all. Why is everything acting up today? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. The house is tired, said a voice beside me. I turned and saw a small, wiry man sitting cross-legged on the lawn. He wore a suit made entirely of shadows, which shifted and rippled like smoke as he moved. His face, however, was ordinary. Soft features, a slight stubble, and eyes the color of rain-soaked pavement. He looked like someone I should know but didn't. Tired of what? I asked. Of you, he said, smiling faintly, or rather, of holding you. I stared at him. Holding me? Places do that, he said, gesturing at the house. They hold you. Your memories, your thoughts, your weight. Sometimes, though, they need a break. Today, your house decided to let go. I looked back at the house, which now appeared smaller somehow, like it was shrinking into itself. The windows had gone dark, their usual gleam gone, and the roof slouched as though exhaling a breath it had held for years. What am I supposed to do? The man shrugged. Most people leave when this happens. Find a new place to be held. And if I don't want to leave? He tilted his head, considering me. Then you find what's missing. What's missing? You'll know it when you see it, he said, standing in one fluid motion. His shadow suit billowed behind him, stretching longer than any shadow had a right to be. But don't take too long. Houses don't wait forever. He stepped into the air like it was solid ground, his shadow blending with the clouds at his feet, and vanished without another word. The house let out a low groan behind me, like an old ship in rough waters. I stood up and walked back inside. The walls were peeling faster now, their spirals twisting deeper and deeper into something I couldn't see. The floorboards creaked, shifting subtly under my weight, and the light overhead flickered like it was trying to tell me something. I took a deep breath. All right, I said aloud. What's missing? A shiver ran through the house, and for a moment, everything stopped. The walls froze mid-peel, the furniture stilled, and the air grew thick and still. Then, from somewhere deep inside, I heard it, the faint sound of music. It wasn't coming from the radio or any speaker I owned. It was older than that, soft, slow, and familiar. I followed the sound, stepping carefully over the restless floorboards, through rooms that didn't quite look the way they should. The living room had stretched itself into a long, narrow hallway lined with doors I'd never seen before. Each one was different, one covered in ivy, another made of glass, another so small I'd have to crawl to get through. But the music came from the door at the very end. It was wooden and worn, its surface smooth like it had been touched 1,000 times before. I reached for the handle, and as soon as I touched it, the house seemed to sigh. The walls settled. The groaning stopped. I opened the door. On the other side was a room I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. It was filled with golden light, dust motes drifting through the air like tiny stars. At the center of the room sat a piano, its keys gleaming. The music was coming from there, though no one was playing. I walked toward it, my footsteps muffled by the thick, warm air. When I sat down on the bench, the music stopped. The silence pressed against me, waiting. I placed my hands on the keys. The moment I played the first note, the house shuddered awake. The walls unfolded themselves, the floorboards stopped shifting, and the light returned to the windows. I played slowly at first, the melody familiar though I couldn't place it. With each note, the house seemed to breathe more deeply, its tension easing, its cracks filling. I played until the room glowed brighter, until the ceiling stretched back into place, until I could no longer hear anything but the music and the beating of my own heart. When I stopped, the house was still, peaceful. The room behind me was just a room again, ordinary and safe. I stood up and walked back to the front door, where the morning sun now shone through clear glass. My bed was back where it belonged. My blanket had returned to the foot of it, and the furniture had settled into place like nothing had happened. I stepped outside. The sky was blue, the grass green, the clouds exactly where they should be. The man in the shadow suit was gone, but I thought I heard his voice on the breeze, saying softly, "Houses don't forget. Neither should you." I sat on the porch and listened to the wind, feeling the house behind me, whole and holding me once again. Let me tell you about the day I got stuck in a never-ending grocery store. It started innocently enough. I just needed milk. That's it. Nothing fancy, just a gallon of milk to survive another morning of sad cereal before work. I walked into the store around 7 p.m., right after the rush, when the aisles were quiet and the fluorescent lights hummed like a swarm of sleepy bees. The place was almost empty, just a few late-night shoppers and the usual overworked cashier staring blankly at the candy rack. At first, everything was normal. I grabbed a cart, wheeled it toward the dairy aisle, and tossed in my gallon of milk. I was about to head to checkout when I remembered I was out of coffee, and eggs, and maybe bread too. You know how it goes. One thing becomes 5 things, and suddenly your quick stop turns into a full grocery run. I pushed my cart down the cereal aisle, turned right at the condiments, and stopped. The aisle didn't end. It just kept going, shelves stretching endlessly in both directions, packed with rows of mustard, ketchup, hot sauce, mayonnaise, and about 12 brands of barbecue sauce I'd never heard of. I figured I must have gotten turned around somehow, so I glanced behind me to backtrack. Except the aisle behind me didn't lead back to the cereal. It stretched on, too, shelves packed with identical bottles of pickles and jars of olives as far as I could see. I stood there, staring at the endless shelves, my brain trying to make sense of what it was seeing. "Okay," I muttered. "This is weird." A part of me thought maybe the store had installed some kind of funhouse mirror thing, like an optical illusion for their anniversary or a Halloween stunt. But when I walked forward, the shelves didn't shift or distort. They just kept going. After about 5 minutes of walking, I stopped again. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. "Is anyone here?" Nothing. I tried retracing my steps, turning corners, even closing my eyes and spinning around like I was playing hide and seek. But every time I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by more aisles, more shelves, more stuff. And it wasn't just condiments anymore. There were rows of pasta, stacks of cereal boxes, towers of canned soup. It was like the store had folded in on itself, expanding endlessly in every direction. Panic started to creep in. My cart, still holding that stupid gallon of milk, felt like a lifeline. So I gripped it tightly and kept walking. I passed by the same rows of items over and over. Or maybe I didn't. The products looked identical, but sometimes they'd be slightly off. A can of tomato soup with a label written in a language I didn't recognize, a loaf of bread with no brand name, just the word bread, stamped in bold red letters. One aisle was filled entirely with bananas, but they were green and bulbous, like they'd been designed by someone who'd heard of bananas but never actually seen one. That's when I heard it, the faint squeak of cart wheels. I froze. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Someone else was here. "Hello?" I called out. The squeaking stopped. I gripped my cart tighter and pushed forward, heart pounding. As I turned the corner, I saw her, a woman about my age, standing in front of a shelf filled with cereal boxes. She was staring at them like she was trying to decode a message. Her cart was empty, except for a single can of soup. "Hey," I said, relief flooding my voice. "Thank God. I thought I was the only one here." She turned slowly, her expression calm but off, like she wasn't surprised to see me. "You just got here, didn't you?" "What?" "Yeah, I mean, I came in for milk and—" "You should have stuck to the milk," she interrupted, her voice flat. "What's going on?" I asked. "Why can't I find the exit?" She gestured to the endless aisles around us. "There's no exit. Her words hit me like a gut punch. What do you mean, no exit? I've been here for weeks, she said, her tone unnervingly calm. Maybe longer. It's hard to keep track of time. That's not possible, I stammered. This is a grocery store. Yeah, she said. That's what I thought too. She picked up a box of cereal and studied it. The box was blank, except for a smiling cartoon face. She put it back on the shelf. You'll get used to it. Used to what? I snapped, my voice rising. What is this place? She tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to decide how much to tell me. It's not a store. Not really. It just looks like one. It changes, adapts. You can keep walking, but you won't find a door. I stared at her, my brain spinning in circles. This had to be a prank, or a dream, or a mental breakdown. But the way she looked at me, calm, resigned, it made my stomach twist. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm getting out of here. She didn't argue. She just shrugged and pushed her cart down the aisle, disappearing around the corner. I tried to follow her, but when I turned the corner, she was gone. I spent what felt like hours, or maybe days, wandering the aisles, calling out, searching for her, for anyone, for anything that made sense. The products became stranger, nonsensical. Jars filled with swirling colors, cans labeled with nothing but question marks, boxes that rattled as though something was alive inside. The air felt heavier, and the humming of the lights seemed to sync with my heartbeat. At some point, I collapsed against a shelf, clutching the cart like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. That's when I noticed something. One of the shelves was empty, completely bare except for a single item. A key. It was small, brass, and impossibly ordinary. Without thinking, I picked it up. As soon as I touched it, the humming stopped. The lights flickered. The aisles around me blurred and folded inward, like I was standing at the center of a collapsing kaleidoscope. And then, just as suddenly, I was standing outside, the cool night air brushing against my face. The grocery store behind me was dark, its windows blank, the neon, open 24 hours, sign flickering weakly. I still don't know what happened. I don't know where the woman went, or why I found the key, or why the store let me go. But sometimes, when I walk past that store late at night, I think I hear it. The faint hum of the lights, the squeak of cartwheels, the sound of something waiting. The stranger knocked at my door just after midnight. Not the polite, hesitant knock you expect from someone lost or confused. This was rhythmic, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock. I sat up in bed, heart hammering in my chest. My apartment was on the 5th floor, in a building that most people forgot existed, tucked between two massive construction projects that swallowed all the light and sound. Nobody came here by accident. For a long moment, I didn't move. I listened, waiting for the knock to come again, to prove I wasn't imagining it. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock. I swung my legs off the bed, the chill of the floor snapping me out of my fog. The air in the apartment felt heavier somehow, like the walls had leaned in closer while I was sleeping. I grabbed a hoodie off the back of a chair and padded barefoot to the door. I didn't look through the peephole. Some instinct, old and primal, told me not to. Instead, I pressed my hand flat against the wood. Who's there? For a second, nothing. Silence stretched so thin it felt ready to tear. Then a voice replied, soft and calm. It's me. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was neutral, smooth as polished glass. It didn't echo through the hall or seep through the crack beneath the door. It just existed directly on the other side. You have the wrong apartment, I said, though I already knew that wasn't true. No, the voice replied gently. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Something about that sentence twisted in my chest. I glanced at the chain lock, reassured by its dull, tarnished metal, then finally looked through the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty, lit by the same flickering fluorescent bulb that had been dying since I moved in. I stayed there for a long minute, watching nothing, listening to the faint hum of the light fixture. Then, cautiously, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, perfectly centered in front of my doorframe, was a box. It wasn't big, shoebox-sized, plain cardboard with no markings or labels. It sat there like it had grown out of the carpet itself. I glanced both ways down the hall. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet thrum of a building that felt more asleep than alive. I knelt down, hesitating before I touched the box. The cardboard was cold, much colder than it should have been. My fingers tingled against it like they were brushing ice. I picked it up carefully and brought it inside, shutting and locking the door behind me. I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it. I don't know why I expected it to do something, but I did. It just sat there, plain and still, daring me to open it. I reached for a knife and sliced through the tape, my breath shallow. The lid lifted easily, and inside, there was only a note, folded neatly in half, with my name written on it in that same, polished handwriting that doesn't belong to real people. I unfolded it. "You've been chosen. Take it to the mirror." Take what to the mirror? I looked back in the box and saw something I swear hadn't been there before. A key. It sat perfectly centered, a small brass thing, tarnished and worn, with a bow shaped like an open eye. I picked it up. It was warm, far warmer than the box had been, and it pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. I turned to the mirror in my hallway, the full-length one that hung across from my coat rack. For a second, I almost laughed. This was absurd. The key was nonsense. The note was nonsense. I was standing in my apartment, in my hoodie and socks, holding a mysterious key that felt like it was breathing in my hand. None of this was real, except it was. I stepped in front of the mirror, and my reflection stared back at me. Nothing strange about it. Just me, dark circles under my eyes, hair a mess. I held the key up, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then I noticed something. My reflection wasn't holding the key. I froze, heart skittering in my chest. My reflection's hand was empty, fingers curled slightly, as if they were resting around the shape of something that wasn't there. I wiggled my fingers. It didn't. I stepped back. It didn't move. Slowly, its empty hand rose, one finger lifting to point, not at me, but at the corner of the mirror, where a small keyhole had appeared in the frame. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I didn't want to do it. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to throw the box and the key into the trash, to leave my apartment and never come back. But my hand moved on its own, trembling as it lifted the key to the keyhole. It slid in perfectly, like it had been waiting. When I turned the key, the mirror rippled. The surface moved like water disturbed by a single drop, waves radiating outward. My reflection didn't move. It just watched me, the same neutral expression on its face. Then it stepped forward. I didn't move, but it did. It pushed one foot out of the mirror, bare and pale, the toes curling against my floor. Its leg followed, then its other foot, until it was standing in front of me, whole and real. I couldn't breathe. It looked just like me, every freckle, every scar. But its eyes were wrong. They were empty, like someone had taken a photograph of my face and erased the life behind it. It smiled. "Thank you," it said. It reached out and touched my chest, its fingers curling into the fabric of my hoodie. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My limbs felt heavy, rooted to the spot as though gravity itself had grown claws. My reflection leaned closer, its face inches from mine, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then it turned, stepped back into the mirror, and disappeared. The ripples stilled. The keyhole vanished. My reflection was back, normal now, moving when I moved, mirroring every nervous breath. But I could feel it. The air in the apartment had shifted. The walls were leaning in again, closer than before. I turned away from the mirror, but the feeling didn't leave. It sat on my chest like a weight. The room was too quiet, too still. I looked back over my shoulder. The reflection hadn't moved. It smiled. I ran. I don't live in that apartment anymore. I packed what I could carry and left that night. I don't look at mirrors now. Not full-length ones. Not handheld ones. Not the windows of shop fronts that reflect me as I pass. I know it's still there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, when I glance at a puddle on the sidewalk, I see its face staring back at me, smiling that smile that isn't mine. And when I'm alone in the dark, I hear knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock. It always knows where to find me. It began with a string. I found it tied to my doorknob when I came home. A red string, thin as thread but impossibly vibrant, like it had been dipped in fresh blood. It stretched taut across the hallway, perfectly level with the ground, and disappeared under my neighbor's door. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank or a weird decoration. I stared at it for a long moment, my keys still in my hand, feeling an unease I couldn't explain. It looked deliberate, intentional, like it was waiting for me. I bent down to inspect it, brushing my fingertips against the string. It was warm, almost alive. The moment I touched it, a jolt shot up my arm. Not painful, but sharp, like static that hadn't quite let go. I pulled my hand back and glanced at the neighbor's door. Apartment 4B. I didn't know much about them, never saw them, never heard them. For all I knew, the place was empty. For the rest of the evening, I tried to ignore the string. I made dinner, watched TV, and convinced myself that someone would come and take it down soon. But when I checked a few hours later, it was still there, glowing faintly under the dim hallway light. I noticed then that it wasn't just stretched between the doors. The string continued. It looped down the hallway, around corners, past the stairwell, and disappeared into the building's darkened interior, as if it were unraveling a path. I don't know why I followed it. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper, like the pull of a question I didn't want answered but couldn't resist asking. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my shoes, and stepped into the hallway, shutting my door behind me. The building was silent, the air thick and still, like the walls were holding their breath. The red string led me forward, unwavering and smooth, as though someone had stretched it perfectly in a single motion. I passed my neighbor's door, then the stairwell, and followed it around corner after corner. The string didn't dip, sag, or fray. It remained perfect, stretching endlessly into the darkness. After a while, I realized I was walking deeper into the building than I ever had before. The halls became unfamiliar, as if I'd stepped into a different version of the place I lived in. The wallpaper was older here, peeling and faded, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. A chill settled into the air, though I couldn't find a source for it. I glanced at the doors I passed. None of them had numbers. Their surfaces were scratched, as though something had clawed at them, and their knobs were rusted over. The string pulled me forward. Eventually, I reached an elevator. The doors were old, Art Deco, brass with a swirling design like something from a forgotten hotel. I'd never seen it before, but the string disappeared inside. Above the doors, a faded plaque read, "For tenants only." I hesitated, every instinct in my body telling me to turn back, but I stepped forward anyway and pressed the call button. It glowed faintly, flickering like a dying firefly. The elevator groaned as it arrived, the doors creaking open to reveal a velvet-lined interior with brass handrails and a mirrored ceiling. It smelled faintly of dust and roses. The string stretched across the floor, leading to a single button on the panel. B. Basement. I didn't remember the building having a basement. The doors slid shut behind me, and the elevator began its descent. It moved slowly, too slowly, as if the machinery was reluctant to let me through. The hum of the elevator filled the silence, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to burrow into my bones. The mirror on the ceiling reflected me perfectly, but when I looked closer, I noticed the reflection didn't match. My hands were clenched at my sides, but in the mirror, my reflection was reaching toward the string. I tore my eyes away and stared at the button until the elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors opened, and I stepped out into darkness. The flashlight's beam cut through the black, revealing a long corridor lined with doors on either side. These doors were worse than the ones upstairs, twisted and warped, as though they'd been burned and frozen at the same time. The string continued along the floor, glowing faintly as it led me forward. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at me like someone else was following. I passed door after door, each one silent, until I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, curling through the dark like smoke, but it grew louder the further I walked. The voice wasn't clear, just the shape of words, like someone speaking underwater. I swept my flashlight across the doors, searching for the source, and stopped when I found one that was slightly ajar. The string went inside. The whispering grew louder, pressing against my ears. I didn't want to open the door, but the string was pulling now, an invisible force tugging me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a man, or what had been a man. He was impossibly thin, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones, and his suit hung loose, as though it belonged to someone much larger. His head was bowed, his hair dark and matted, and the string ran straight to him, looping around his wrists, his ankles, and disappearing into his chest. His head lifted slowly. His face was pale and smooth, too smooth, like a mask carved from wax. Where his mouth should have been was a seam, stitched shut with the same red string. His eyes were wide and empty, deep hollows that reflected nothing. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. The man tilted his head as if studying me, and I felt the tug again. Harder this time, pulling me toward him. "Help me." The voice wasn't spoken. It slid through the air like a thought, a soundless whisper that echoed in my skull. The man raised his arms, the string pulling taut around his wrists, digging into his skin. I watched, frozen, as the thread began to unravel. Slowly, deliberately, disappearing back into his body. The man convulsed, his stitched mouth trembling, and the whisper grew louder until it was a scream. I ran. I sprinted down the corridor, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The whisper followed me, an endless voice clawing at my mind, screaming words I couldn't understand. The string was everywhere now, crisscrossing the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Impossible knots that tangled around me as I stumbled. I don't remember how I got out. I just remember the elevator doors slamming shut behind me, the hum of its machinery carrying me upward as I gasped for air. When I stumbled out onto my floor, the string was gone. The hallway was normal again, silent, empty, ordinary. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room with all the lights on, staring at the door, waiting for the string to return. It hasn't. Not yet. But sometimes, when the world is quiet, I feel it. A pull, faint and distant, as though the string is still tied to me, waiting for me to follow it again. There's a house at the edge of town that only appears when you're not looking for it. It sits on a sloped lot where the asphalt of the road crumbles into weeds, and the trees crowd too close, their branches thick and heavy like they're trying to shield the house from view. Everyone in town knows about it, but no one talks about it directly. It's like a shared secret, the kind of thing people dismiss with a joke or a wave of their hand. "Oh, that place? No one goes there." But sometimes people do, and sometimes they don't come back the same. I found the house on a Tuesday in November. I hadn't been looking for anything except a way to clear my head. I was driving aimlessly through back roads that stitched their way between empty fields and half-dead forests. My headlights cut through the early evening mist, and the sky was the color of bruised peaches, purple, orange, a hint of something sour. That's when I saw it, right as I rounded a curve that didn't feel familiar. The house appeared, sitting at the end of a narrow, gravel drive that I was certain hadn't been there before. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding slightly. The house seemed to stare back at me through the trees. It wasn't much to look at. 2 stories tall, with peeling white paint and windows so dark they looked like they were holding their breath. A porch wrapped around the front, its wooden slats buckled and warped with time, and the railing hung loose in places, like teeth ready to fall out. There were no lights on, no cars parked outside, but the driveway was smooth, like someone had been taking care of it. I told myself I'd turn around, back up, keep driving, forget about it. But my hands moved before my brain could stop them, turning the wheel onto the gravel path. The sound of the stones under my tires was deafening, like they were trying to warn me. When I stepped out of the car, the air was colder than it should have been. The trees were silent, no wind rustling the leaves, no distant hum of traffic or life. It was as if the world had emptied itself out around the house, leaving me alone with it. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the second floor. I had the strangest feeling that someone was watching me from one of the windows, even though I couldn't see anything but black glass. My breath misted in front of me as I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. I knocked on the door before I realized what I was doing. 3 sharp raps that echoed too loudly. No one answered, but the door, with its faded brass knob and chipped paint, swung inward, slow and deliberate, like it had been expecting me. I hesitated. I don't know what I was waiting for. Some sign that I should leave, a voice in my head telling me this was stupid, but the house stayed silent, its open door an invitation I couldn't seem to refuse. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't musty or rotting, like you'd expect from a place like this. Instead, it smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter, like burnt sugar. The entryway was small, with scuffed hardwood floors and wallpaper that had faded to a dull green. A staircase climbed up to the 2nd floor, its banister polished and gleaming. On my left, a sitting room stretched out, empty except for a single chair positioned in the center of the room, facing nothing. The chair looked new, out of place, its upholstery clean and dark blue. It was the kind of chair someone might sit in to wait, or to watch. I called out, "Hello?" My voice came out thin and weak. It didn't echo. The house absorbed it like it was hungry for the sound. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps muffled on the wooden floor. The kitchen was next. It was pristine, with pale cabinets and a white tile countertop that looked freshly scrubbed. A kettle sat on the stove, its copper surface so polished it reflected the light from the window. Something about it unsettled me. The whole house felt like a photograph, like it was holding still for me. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The hallway I'd come through was different. The wallpaper had changed. The dull green pattern was gone, replaced with something darker, deep red, almost like velvet, with swirling patterns that moved slightly if I stared too long. The doorway I'd entered through was no longer there. In its place was another hallway, stretching out far longer than it should have been, lined with closed doors on either side. My chest tightened, and my pulse began to race. I turned back toward the kitchen window, but the view outside was gone. Where there had once been trees and gravel, there was now only fog, dense and gray, pressed up against the glass like it wanted to get in. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before I heard it, a faint sound, like someone humming. It was coming from down the hallway. I didn't want to follow it, but my feet moved anyway. The doors I passed were identical, plain wood, each with a brass handle that gleamed like it had been polished yesterday. I didn't try any of them. The humming grew louder, clearer, until I could make out a melody. It was simple and slow, the kind of tune someone might sing to a child to help them fall asleep. It was coming from the last door at the end of the hall. When I reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I would. I had to. The door swung inward, revealing a small room that didn't match the rest of the house. It was warm, with pale yellow walls and a rocking chair in the corner. A figure sat in the chair, swaying back and forth in time with the humming. It was a woman, or something shaped like a woman, her face hidden beneath a veil of long, dark hair. She was holding something in her lap, cradling it like a baby. The humming stopped. The room was silent again. Slowly, her head turned toward me, and though I couldn't see her face, I knew she was smiling. She lifted the thing in her lap, holding it out like an offering. It wasn't a baby. It wasn't anything. Just a bundle of empty cloth, wrapped tight. "You're late," she said. Her voice was soft and sweet, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped back, shaking my head, but the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to run, but the room was different now. It wasn't warm anymore. The yellow walls had gone dark, and the rocking chair was empty. I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember how I got back to my car. All I know is that I woke up in my bed the next morning, the taste of burnt sugar still on my tongue and dirt on my shoes. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, but when I checked my car, there was gravel in the tires. The house isn't there anymore. I've driven back to that road a dozen times, looking for it, but all I find is trees and weeds. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. That soft, simple humming, coming from somewhere just outside the edge of my dreams. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Soft, like a distant hum, just barely audible over the faint rustle of the city. It didn't seem like anything at first, just a peculiar background noise as I waited on the corner where he told me to meet him. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized it was getting louder, taking on a kind of rhythm, a pulse, like the city itself was alive and breathing. And then I saw him. He was wearing a red coat that seemed too bright for the dim light of the street, the kind of red that demanded attention. In one hand, he held a small black box. In the other, a single balloon, glowing faintly like it had swallowed a piece of the moon. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me the box with that lopsided grin I was beginning to recognize. I took the box, skeptical but intrigued, and opened it. Inside was a pair of old headphones, the kind you'd find in a thrift store next to dusty vinyl records. The ear pads were slightly frayed, but there was something charming about their imperfection. "What is this?" I asked, holding them up. "Your ticket," he said, as if that explained anything. "Put them on." Against my better judgment, but fully in the spirit of whatever game he was playing, I slipped them over my ears. At first, there was nothing, just a faint static, but then a voice crackled through, warm and rich, like a storyteller unraveling a bedtime tale. "Welcome to the Soundwalk," it said. "Your journey begins here." I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. He just motioned for me to follow, the glowing balloon bobbing slightly in the cool night air. And so we walked, me with the headphones and him leading the way. The voice in my ears continued, narrating the city as if it were a story I hadn't noticed before. "Look to your left," it said, and I did, spotting a cluster of wildflowers growing through the cracks of the pavement, vibrant and defiant against the gray concrete. "There," the voice continued, "is proof that beauty finds a way, even in places where it shouldn't belong." He guided me toward an alley I'd never noticed before, narrow and shadowy but oddly inviting. The voice directed me to pause, to listen, and when I did, I heard it. The faint drip of water from a pipe, the shuffle of leaves caught in a breeze, the distant echo of laughter spilling out of an open window. "This alley," the voice said, "has held 100,000 footsteps, each one left behind a little story." I glanced at him again, and he was watching me, his grin softer now, like he was letting me in on a secret. As we walked deeper into the city, the Soundwalk seemed to sync with the world around me. The hum I'd noticed earlier became music, faint but growing louder with every step, as if the streets themselves were an orchestra warming up. The voice would occasionally chime in with prompts. "Look up," it said at one point, and when I did, I saw a clothesline strung between two buildings, dotted with colorful scarves swaying in the wind like flags from a foreign land. "Close your eyes," it said later, and I hesitated, but I did it. That's when I heard the rhythm of the city in full force, the shuffle of feet, the honk of a distant car, the hiss of a bus stopping, and underneath it all, that hum, steady and alive. We stopped at a bench overlooking a small park, and he gestured for me to sit. The voice in my ears quieted, replaced by a soft piano melody that felt both familiar and entirely new. "Do you hear it now?" he asked, breaking the silence for the first time since we started. "Hear what?" I asked. He pointed toward the park. "The city's heartbeat." It sounded absurd, but in that moment, I did hear it, or maybe I just wanted to. The wind rustled the trees, their leaves catching the light from a street lamp and casting golden shadows on the ground. A group of kids laughed as they chased each other, their sneakers squeaking against the pavement. Somewhere, a dog barked once, twice, before settling back into the night. It all blended together, chaotic yet harmonious, like a symphony that didn't need a conductor. After a while, he stood in motion for me to follow again. The next stop was a small bridge that arched over a canal. He handed me the balloon and nodded toward the water. "Let it go," he said. I hesitated. "Why?" "Because sometimes," he said, "you have to let something go to see where it wants to take you." It sounded like something out of a fortune cookie, but I let the balloon slip from my fingers anyway. It drifted upward, the glow reflecting off the water below, and for a moment, it looked like two moons rising, one in the sky, one in the canal. The Soundwalk guided us to our final destination, a rooftop. I don't know how he had access to it, and I didn't ask. It was better not to know. He climbed first, pulling me up after him, and suddenly we were above it all, the city stretching out in every direction, alive with lights and movement and sound. He took the headphones from me and placed them over his own ears. "You've heard enough," he said, pulling out his phone and fiddling with something. A moment later, a new sound filled the air. Faint at first, but growing louder. A melody that felt like it had been stitched together from all the noises we'd heard throughout the night. The hum, the piano, the laughter, the wind. They were all there, woven into a song that seemed to belong to the city itself. "This," he said, gesturing toward the skyline, "is what I hear all the time. The city is never quiet. It's always telling stories, but most people don't stop long enough to listen." I stood there, trying to take it all in. The music, the view, the sheer weight of the moment. And then he turned to me, his face serious for the first time all night. "Do you hear it now?" he asked again, and this time I nodded. I didn't need the headphones anymore. We stayed on that rooftop until the music faded, replaced by the natural rhythm of the city below. When we climbed back down, the world felt different. Not louder, but fuller, like it had been waiting for me to notice it all along. As we walked back to where we started, he handed me the headphones again, now carefully tucked back into their box. "Keep them," he said. "There's more to hear." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. When I got home, I sat by the window, watching the city and listening, really listening, for the first time, and I realized he was right. The city did have a heartbeat, and now I couldn't stop hearing it. Every Thursday at midnight, we chased shadows. Not the kind you see lurking in dark corners or flickering under street lamps, but the ones you only noticed if you were really looking, the ones most people missed. It started on one of those nights when the city felt too loud and empty at the same time. We couldn't sleep, so we wandered out into the cool darkness, neither of us saying much until she stopped suddenly under the halo of a streetlight. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing at her feet. I looked down. Her shadow stretched across the pavement, long and sharp, but there was something odd about it. It looked wrong. A little too thin, a little too quick. It rippled as if it were breathing. "It moved," she said, her voice edged with wonder and maybe a little fear. "It's just a shadow," I said, but I felt it too, a weird hum in the air, like something just under the surface of the world had rippled. She took a step forward, and the shadow darted away. I didn't know shadows could do that. We both froze. Did it just run? And then, without thinking, she bolted after it. "Wait," I yelled, stumbling after her as she sprinted down the empty street. That was the night we discovered the chase. The shadow led us into alleys and across deserted parking lots, slipping under fences and through puddles that didn't ripple when it passed. We didn't catch it, of course we didn't. But when we finally stopped, panting and laughing under the flicker of an old neon sign, it felt like we'd been let in on a secret. The world, it turned out, had hidden places. You just had to know how to look for them. From then on, Thursday nights were for shadow chasing. It became our ritual, our private magic. Every week, we'd wait until the city went quiet, until the only sounds were the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a lonely dog. Then we'd head out with flashlights and sharp eyes, looking for signs that the shadows were restless. We learned how to spot them. A shadow that didn't match its owner's shape. One that rippled like water when no breeze was blowing. Or the most obvious one, a shadow that moved just after the person casting it had stopped. Those were the tricky ones. "They're like fish," she said once, crouched in an alley as we watched a shadow dart under a dumpster. "You've got to sneak up on them. Let them think you're not looking." We started keeping a shadow map. It was a beat-up notebook where we scribbled locations where the shadows had been strange. The parking lot behind the diner, flickering shadow under the lamp at 12:41 a.m. The playground swings at Park Street, shadow moved sideways. The map grew quickly, covered in arrows, dots, and cryptic notes like "shadow tried to hide under bench." Why? Sometimes we just followed them, watching as they flitted along walls or crept across empty intersections. Other nights, we got bolder. We tried to trap one once, shining our flashlights from 2 different angles until the shadow had nowhere to go. It squirmed there for a moment, a dark smear on the ground, before it wriggled free and slipped under a storm drain. "We almost had it," she said, grinning like a kid who just caught a firefly. "Next time." We started to notice things no one else did. Shadows avoided mirrors. They didn't like bright colors. One shadow flinched visibly when it touched the edge of her red scarf. Some shadows moved like animals, quick and darting, while others seemed slow, almost thoughtful, like they were listening for something we couldn't hear. One night, we found a shadow with no person attached to it. It stretched across an abandoned lot, moving sluggishly as if it were tired. She crouched beside it, her flashlight pointed just at the edge. "Where'd you lose your human, huh?" she whispered. I half expected it to answer. Of course, no one believed us. We tried to tell our friends once, but they just laughed. "You're chasing shadows? Isn't that like a metaphor for wasting time?" "They don't get it," she said after, shaking her head. "It's not a metaphor. It's real." The thing is, I wasn't sure what it was. The shadows weren't ghosts. They weren't alive, not really. But they weren't just darkness either. They were something in between, something forgotten. One Thursday, she didn't show up at our usual meeting spot. I waited under the street lamp for an hour, my breath fogging in the cold air, but she never came. The next morning, she called me. "I think I need to stop," she said. "What do you mean, stop?" "The shadows. The chasing. I think it's getting too close." I didn't know what to say. She wouldn't explain. I didn't see her for weeks after that, but I kept going. I couldn't help it. The shadows were still out there, slipping under doorways, flickering behind fences, waiting to be seen. I felt like we'd opened a door, and I couldn't close it again. One night, I returned to the abandoned lot where we'd found the lonely shadow. I stood there in the dark, flashlight off, and waited. After a while, I saw it. A slow, sluggish movement along the cracked pavement. "Where do you go when no one's looking?" I whispered to it, half to myself. The shadow shifted, just slightly. I swear, for the briefest moment, it stretched toward me. I haven't told her that part. I don't know if she'd want to hear it, but I still chased them. Every Thursday at midnight, notebook in hand, following trails of darkness no one else sees. I don't know what I'm looking for anymore. Proof? Answers? Or maybe just the feeling we had on that first night. The wonder of realizing the world was bigger, stranger, and more alive than we'd ever thought. Maybe the shadows are just shadows. Or maybe, like her, they're trying to slip away before we get too close. What about you? Have you ever seen something, just for a moment, that didn't feel like it was supposed to be there? Something strange hiding in plain sight? I didn't mean to invent a new color. It just happened. And honestly, I wish it hadn't. It started on a Tuesday, which feels important for some reason. Tuesdays are the forgotten stepchildren of the week. Not as bad as Monday, not as hopeful as Wednesday. It's a day for things to go unnoticed, for mistakes to sneak through the cracks. Maybe that's why no one stopped me when I walked out of the craft store carrying an unmarked jar of paint that I hadn't paid for. For the record, I wasn't trying to steal it. I'd been looking for a specific shade of green for this dumb little painting I was working on. Something between moss and sage, if that makes sense. The kind of green that feels like it belongs in the background of a fairy tale. I found the jar shoved in the back of a dusty shelf, unlabeled, with no price tag. When I went to the register, the cashier didn't even notice it in my basket. Neither did I, honestly. Not until I got home and unpacked everything. The jar was small and plain. The paint inside a strange, silvery green that shimmered faintly in the light. It looked alive, almost like the color was moving just beneath the surface. I should have been more curious, or at least cautious, but I was tired and cranky and just wanted to finish my painting so I could go back to pretending I was a real artist instead of a hobbyist with too much time on her hands. I pried the lid off and dipped my brush in. The paint was smooth, almost slippery, and when I applied the first stroke to the canvas, I froze. It wasn't green, not moss, not sage, not anything I'd ever seen before. It was a color that didn't have a name, a color that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't just one color, either. It shifted as I looked at it, like a trick of the light, except there wasn't any light to trick me. It was as if the paint was deciding, moment by moment, what it wanted to be. I couldn't stop staring at it. It wasn't just beautiful. It was compelling, mesmerizing. The more I looked, the more I felt like it was looking back, pulling me into it, swallowing me whole. I blinked hard and stepped away from the canvas, my pulse racing. What the hell? I muttered to no one in particular, which is something I do when I'm nervous. I should have stopped. I should have closed the jar, thrown it in the trash, set it on fire, or buried it in the backyard like a cursed relic. But I didn't. Instead, I kept painting. The hours blurred. The brush felt weightless in my hand, moving as if it had a mind of its own. The paint flowed effortlessly, forming shapes I hadn't planned, patterns that seemed to rise from the canvas rather than sit on top of it. The colors shifted constantly, shimmering and pulsing like it was alive, and by the time I finished, I was shaking. The painting was wrong. Not bad, exactly, just wrong. It was a forest, or something like a forest, tall, twisting trees with branches that stretched too far and shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. The air in the painting seemed heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't name. And then there were the eyes, hidden in the darkness, scattered among the trees. There were dozens of tiny, glimmering eyes staring back at me. I told myself it was just a trick of the paint, an optical illusion caused by the way the colors shifted. But deep down, I knew better. I'd put something into the painting that didn't belong there, something that wasn't mine. That night, I dreamed of the forest. I was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by trees that groaned like old wood on the verge of snapping. The air smelled damp, like moss and decay, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, too soft, like something alive was writhing just below the surface. I heard whispers, low, guttural murmurs in a language I didn't understand, and when I turned around, I saw them. The eyes. They were closer now, gleaming in the shadows, unblinking. I couldn't see what they belonged to, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The forest seemed to lean toward me, its branches creaking and shifting like they were reaching for me. I ran. When I woke up, the painting was different. The trees had shifted slightly, their branches bending toward the edges of the canvas as if they were trying to escape. The eyes were still there, but now there were more of them, clustered closer together, watching me. The paint itself looked darker, heavier, like it was sinking into the canvas, pulling everything down with it. I tried to ignore it. I threw a sheet over the painting, shoved it into the corner of the room, and told myself it was just a bad dream, just my imagination. But the whispers didn't stop. I heard them in the back of my mind, faint and distant, like wind through the trees. I started sleeping with the lights on. I stopped going into the room where I'd left the painting. I told myself it wasn't real, but the whispers got louder. 3 days after I finished the painting, I woke up to find the sheet on the floor and the painting leaning against the wall, right next to my bed. The eyes were so close now they filled the canvas, their light spilling into the room like moonlight. And the trees weren't in the painting anymore. They were in the room. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, their edges curling into branches that creaked and groaned with every breath I took. Shadows slithered across the floor like they were alive, pooling at the base of the painting. And the whispers, they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and sharp, calling my name. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed the jar of paint and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the park a few blocks away, where I hurled the jar into the pond as hard as I could. It hit the water with a splash, and for a moment, everything was silent. And then the pond shimmered. The water turned the same impossible color as the paint, rippling and shifting as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. The trees around me swayed, their branches reaching toward the water like they were drawn to it. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I could hear the whispers again, louder than ever. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor. When I finally worked up the courage to check the room where I'd left the painting, it was gone. The wall was bare, the canvas nowhere to be found. I haven't painted since. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I see the trees, the shadows, the eyes. I hear the whispers. And sometimes, when I pass the pond on my way to work, I swear I see something shimmering just beneath the surface, watching me. I didn't know a door could bleed. It was the kind of night that made everything feel unreal. The wind howled through the streets, carrying the sound of distant sirens and that faint electric hum that cities seem to exhale when no one's paying attention. I was walking home late, my footsteps muffled by the gusts of air, when I noticed it. A door, freestanding in the middle of an empty lot. It wasn't attached to anything. No building, no frame. Just a door. It was deep red, so dark it was almost black, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. It stood upright, solid, as though it had always been there, though I'd walked past this lot a dozen times before. I stopped, frowning, the wind tugging at my coat. Something about it was wrong. I don't mean ominous, not at first. It was just off. Like finding a missing puzzle piece, only to realize it doesn't belong to your puzzle at all. Naturally, I wanted to ignore it. I even turned away, intending to keep walking. But then the door creaked. The sound was soft, like it was breathing. I turned back. It didn't move, but I swear it watched me, like it knew I was there. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I took a step closer, because curiosity is sometimes stronger than fear. That's the thing they don't tell you about moments like this. The brain wants answers more than it wants safety. As I approached, I saw something seeping from beneath the door. Something dark and thick that pooled on the cracked pavement. I knelt, reaching out instinctively, and stopped just short of touching it. It was red, a vivid, syrupy red. It looked like blood. I stumbled back so fast I nearly fell. The door didn't budge, didn't open, but I heard it again, that creaking sound, rising slightly as though it were laughing. I glanced around, hoping someone else might see this insanity, but the street was empty. I was alone with the wind, the flickering street lamp, and a door that bled. It's just a trick, I told myself. Some weird art installation. A prank. But no amount of reason explained why I could smell it. Coppery, sharp, like the air just before a storm. Or why the wind seemed to quiet as I stood there, as if it, too, was watching. Against all better judgment, I reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than it should have been, like metal left in a freezer. My breath came in shallow gasps as I curled my fingers around it and turned. The door didn't resist. It swung open smoothly, revealing not the empty lot behind it, but something else. I stood at the edge of a vast, impossible field under a green-tinted sky. The ground was smooth and black, as if it had been scorched by a fire that never stopped burning. The air shimmered faintly, and in the distance, I saw figures, thin and twisted, moving in jagged lines, their forms broken and incomplete, as if they were being drawn and erased at the same time. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like falling sideways into a world I was never meant to see. I took a step forward. My foot hit the ground with a hollow sound, like walking on glass. The figures in the distance froze, their heads snapping toward me in perfect unison. I couldn't see their faces, if they even had faces, but I felt their attention, heavy and sharp, pinning me in place. Then one of them began to move. It was slow at first, shambling awkwardly as if trying to remember how to walk. But with each step, it grew faster, smoother, its limbs straightening into something more human. The others followed, spreading out like spiders across the field, all of them rushing toward me, faster and faster. Panic hit me like a punch to the chest. I turned to run back through the door, but it was gone. There was nothing behind me but endless black ground. Where? I gasped, spinning around, trying to find something, anything. The figures were closer now. I could hear them, a sound like wet paper tearing and joints popping. The closest one reached for me with a hand that wasn't a hand at all. It was too long, too jagged, the fingers splitting and merging like ink dropped in water. And then I heard it, the creak of the door. I whipped around. There it was, 10 feet away, standing in the middle of the field like it had always been there. The figures were nearly on me now, their movements so fast they blurred at the edges. I sprinted toward the door, my legs heavy and slow, like I was running through syrup. I reached it just as the first figure's fingertips brushed against my shoulder. The cold of it burned through my coat. and I bit back a scream as I yanked the door open and threw myself through it. I hit the pavement hard. My palms scraped against the gravel, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I slammed the door shut behind me, the impact echoing like thunder. The wind came rushing back, tugging at my hair and clothes. I turned and stared. The door was just a door again, sitting in the middle of the empty lot, still bleeding its slow, dark stain onto the ground. But now there were handprints smeared across it, too many, pressed into the wood at odd angles, some of them overlapping, like 1,000 people had been clawing at it from the other side. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was home, until I'd locked every door and closed every window, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't even turn off the lights. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Eventually, I convinced myself it hadn't been real. I told myself it was stress, hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too little sleep and too much caffeine. I told myself anything to stop hearing the creaking sound of that door whenever I closed my eyes. But 2 days later, I noticed something. A thin streak of red, seeping out from the base of my bedroom closet. And then I heard it again. Creak. Have you ever felt like you opened something you shouldn't have? Like the world gave you one chance to turn away and you ignored it? Because sometimes the door doesn't close all the way. Sometimes it follows you home. It was 3 in the morning when the knocking started. Soft at first, almost polite, like someone gently tapping with their knuckles, testing to see if anyone was awake. I lay there in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, 3 steady knocks, then silence. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. No balcony, no fire escape, and definitely no way for anyone to knock on my bedroom window. I should have ignored it. I should have buried my head under the covers and waited for dawn. But there's something about hearing a sound that doesn't belong in the dead of night that forces your mind to wake up, no matter how tired you are. It's like your body knows something's wrong, even if your brain is too slow to catch up. Knock, knock, knock. This time, louder. I sat up slowly, my sheets pooling around me. My heart was pounding, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The window was just a few feet away, its curtains half drawn. I didn't want to look. Every horror movie, every ghost story I'd ever heard screamed at me to stay in bed, to pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But curiosity, that cursed thing, got the better of me. I slid out of bed, my bare feet brushing against the cool hardwood floor. With each step toward the window, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like I was moving underwater. When I finally reached the window, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the edge of the curtain. For a moment, I let myself believe it could be nothing. A branch tapping in the wind, a trick of my imagination. Knock. I yanked the curtain back. There was nothing there. No face pressed against the glass, no shadow in the night. Just the city skyline stretched out before me, the flicker of streetlights below, and the faint hum of cars in the distance. Relief flooded through me, though it didn't last long. My eyes caught something strange in the reflection of the glass. A movement, quick and sharp, like something darting just behind me. I spun around. The room was empty. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, chalk it up to a bad dream, when I noticed something on the floor near the foot of my bed. A single feather. It wasn't like any feather I'd seen before. It was long and thin, pure black, but when I held it up to the light, it shimmered faintly with an iridescent blue, like an oil slick. It felt wrong in my hand, too heavy, too warm, like it was alive. I stared at it, my mind racing, when the knocking started again. Not on the window this time. The closet. 3 deliberate knocks, coming from the inside. I froze. The closet door was closed, as it had been when I went to bed. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored surface, pale and wide-eyed, the feather still clutched in my hand. Knock, knock, knock. Hello? I whispered, hating how thin and shaky my voice sounded. No response. I took a step closer, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to leave the apartment and never come back. But some invisible thread kept pulling me forward. I reached out and grabbed the handle. It was ice cold. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. At least, it should have been. But now, instead of my neatly hung clothes and cluttered shelves, there was only darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. The air inside was impossibly cold, and the faint sound of whispers drifted out, curling around me like smoke. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I reached for the door to close it, but something stopped me. A voice, low and guttural, called out from the void. "Evelyn." My name. The sound of it chilled me to my core. I dropped the feather, my mind screaming at me to shut the door, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen. But before I could move, something emerged from the darkness. A hand. It was pale and thin, the fingers unnaturally long, the nails black and jagged. It gripped the edge of the closet, pulling the rest of its body into view. It wasn't human. Its face was smooth and featureless, like polished porcelain, but its body was wrapped in feathers like the one I'd found, their shimmering blue-black surface catching the faint light of the room. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, though it had no eyes to see with. "Evelyn," it said again, its voice crawling up my spine like ice. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. What do you want?" I stammered. It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid, like it was gliding instead of walking. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing stopped just inches from me, its smooth face tilted toward mine. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, it reached out and placed a single finger on my forehead. The world around me dissolved. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the sunlight streaming through the window. The closet door was closed, my room exactly as I'd left it, but the feather was gone. I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw it. A small, black mark on my forehead, shaped like a feather. It hasn't left, and at night, when the knocking starts again, I don't answer. I don't look. I just lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to fade. But they never really do. They're always there, just beneath the surface, calling my name. The first time I met Alara, she was selling time. It was in this narrow, crumbling alley downtown, the kind of place that smells like wet concrete and burnt sugar from the bakery on the corner. I was supposed to be meeting a friend for lunch, but my phone buzzed with "running late. Be there in 15. So, naturally, I wandered. That's when I saw her. A small wooden cart tucked into the shadows, draped in mismatched fabrics like it was trying to hide or show off. I couldn't decide which. On the front, a painted sign read, "Time for sale. Cheap. All moments guaranteed." I stopped, staring at it, because what kind of person sets up shop to sell time? Then Alara popped her head up from behind the cart. "You look like someone who's lost a minute or two." She was probably in her 20s, maybe a bit older, but she had that ageless quality. Sharp, clever eyes that made her look like she knew secrets you didn't. Her hair was pulled into messy buns on either side of her head, and her clothes looked like she'd raided a costume trunk. Patchwork coat, fingerless gloves, and boots that could have belonged to a pirate or a poet. Lost a minute? I repeated, not sure if I should be amused or alarmed. Or a day, or a year. Depends on how careless you've been. She waved her hand at the sign like it explained everything. "Lucky for you. I've got time to spare. This is a joke, right?" She arched an eyebrow. "I don't joke about time. Too valuable." I glanced at the cart. On its surface sat an assortment of mismatched jars, all shapes and sizes, corked or lidded. Some filled with what looked like nothing but air. Others shimmered faintly, like they were holding light itself. Tiny, hand-drawn labels were tied to each one. A summer afternoon. 5 more minutes of courage. The night that felt endless. How does this work? I found myself asking. Alara's grin widened. Simple. You pick the time you need. Seconds, minutes, moments, and you buy it. Nothing fake here. All moments guaranteed genuine. And what do I pay? She leaned forward, resting her chin in her hands. That depends. What's it worth to you? I looked at the jars again, part of me ready to walk away, the other part too intrigued to move. And what would you recommend for someone who just wasted 20 minutes waiting for a late friend? Without hesitation, she plucked a small glass bottle off the cart. It was round and dusty, with a faint golden mist swirling inside like liquid sunlight. The label read, "An hour you thought you'd lost." "This one's perfect for you," she said, holding it out. I took the bottle, expecting it to be warm or heavy, but it felt ordinary. "What happens if I open it?" "You get the hour back," she said simply. "You could use it, or you could keep it. People underestimate the power of a moment that's found again, right?" I stared at her, waiting for her to crack and tell me this was all part of some performance art piece. She didn't. She just watched me with those knowing eyes, her expression entirely serious. "How much?" I asked. Alara tilted her head, considering me. "A story." "A story? That's the price. A real one. It doesn't have to be yours, but it has to matter to you." I hesitated. This was ridiculous. I knew it was ridiculous. But something about her, about the whole absurd setup, felt like an invitation I didn't want to turn down. So I told her about the night my grandfather showed me how to find constellations in the sky, how we sat on the roof of his house with blankets wrapped around our shoulders, and he pointed out Orion, Cassiopeia, and the North Star. How he told me that time wasn't about minutes or hours, but about how you spent them. "You can't own time, but you can share it," he'd said. When I finished, Alara looked at me for a long moment. "Good trade," she said softly, taking the empty payment with a kind of reverence, as though the story itself was something tangible. I slipped the jar into my coat pocket and left before my brain could catch up with my feet. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about her or the jar. It sat on my desk, golden mist swirling faintly whenever the light hit it just right. A couple of times, I even picked it up and uncorked it, half expecting something to happen. But nothing did. I figured it was just an elaborate trick, some street performer gimmick or a clever art project, but still, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Then, one night, after an endless day of work and a particularly rough call with my mom, I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling like the weight of everything had finally caught up to me. My eyes landed on the jar. "An hour you thought you'd lost." I don't know what I was expecting when I finally opened it. Maybe a puff of smoke. Maybe absolutely nothing. Instead, the room around me shifted, just slightly, like a breath being drawn in. The clock on my wall seemed to hesitate, one tick too slow, then it stopped entirely. The air filled with this soft golden glow, and for a moment, I felt weightless, like I'd been pulled back into an hour I hadn't realized I'd missed. A moment where everything paused and the world felt softer, gentler, just for me. When the light faded, the clock started again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The jar was empty now, the mist gone. I should have been skeptical, terrified even, but instead, I just felt grateful. After that, I tried to find Alara again. I went back to the alley, checked the streets nearby, even asked the bakery if they'd seen a girl with a cart selling jars. No one had. It's like she disappeared, leaving behind nothing but that memory. But I still think about her sometimes, about how she knew exactly what I needed before I did. I don't know who she was or how any of it worked, but I know this. I don't check my watch as often anymore. I look for constellations. I linger longer in good conversations. Because maybe she was right. Time's not about owning it. It's about how you choose to spend it. Have you ever met someone who gave you exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you were looking for it? So, here's something strange that happens whenever I start to like someone. I get a letter. Not a text. Not a DM. A real, honest-to-goodness letter. Sealed with wax. Written in ink so dark it looks like it might still be wet, and addressed, always, to the future recipient. Me. It shows up wherever I least expect it. On my pillow when I wake up. Folded neatly into my laptop bag. Once, it drifted right out of a book I was reading at the library, fluttering onto the table in front of me like it was embarrassed to be late. I never see who delivers them, but they always come after I realize I have a crush, like some unseen cosmic courier is keeping tabs on my emotional life. The first time it happened, I was 16. I had a massive crush on this guy in my band class, Nick. He played the trumpet, which at the time I thought was the coolest instrument a person could play. I've since reevaluated that opinion, but that's beside the point. One afternoon, I opened my locker, and there it was, a small, cream-colored envelope nestled between my biology textbook and my algebra notes. It was tied with twine. Twine, for God's sake, like it had traveled from the 1800s. Inside was a single sentence, written in the kind of delicate cursive you only see on wedding invitations. He laughs at your jokes even when they're bad. That's something, isn't it? I was stunned. Who wrote this? How did they know? Because, yes, Nick did laugh at my terrible jokes, the ones about saxophones and puns about B-flats. My face burned as I shoved the letter into my backpack, feeling watched and weirdly flattered all at once. I didn't know what to do with it, so I told no one. I thought maybe it was a prank or a weird coincidence. But then it kept happening. In college, it was Maddie, the girl who always sat at the same table as me in the library. She'd smile at me over the top of her books, small, quick smiles that felt like secrets, and my heart would do this clumsy, happy stutter every time. The letter arrived tucked into the pocket of my winter coat, just as I was about to head out. She notices the way you chew on your pen when you're thinking. You're more obvious than you realize. I stared at the note like it was a prophecy. Who was this person? Were they invisible? Psychic? Was this some elaborate game I didn't understand? I spent days trying to catch whoever it was in the act, staring over my shoulder, leaving my backpack open just a crack to see if someone slipped a letter inside. But no matter how careful I was, I never saw them. The letters just kept appearing, always precise, always saying just enough to make me blush and overthink my entire life. At first, I thought they were nudges, little pushes to make me do something brave, like confess how I felt, but they never told me what to do. They just noticed things, whispered details back to me that I hadn't even admitted to myself. Last year, it was Lucas. He was this guy at work who made coffee taste better just by standing near it. He had this weird habit of whistling songs no one recognized, and I found myself listening for it every morning. I hadn't even fully admitted I liked him until the letter appeared, folded in half and tucked into the crook of my windshield wiper. He whistles when he's nervous. He's been whistling more around you lately. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes staring at that sentence. I didn't know whether to feel delighted or deeply unnerved. The fact that Lucas was whistling more often, especially when he talked to me, was something I hadn't noticed until I read the letter. It made me look at him differently, made me wonder if the universe knew something I didn't. Here's the thing. The letters never say too much. Just a sentence or two. Never mean, never mocking. Just observant. Almost kind. Like they're watching my life unfold and leaving breadcrumbs for me to follow. But here's where it gets really weird. A couple of months ago, I started liking someone new, Sasha. She's in my book club and talks with her hands so much it's like watching art in motion. I realized I liked her when I caught myself counting the freckles on her nose during one of her rants about unreliable narrators. Sure enough, the letter showed up. This time, I found it in my kitchen, stuck to the bottom of a jar of peanut butter I swear I hadn't moved in weeks. I opened it with shaking hands. You're not the only one getting letters this time. I froze. What did that mean? I sat on my kitchen floor staring at those words like they might rearrange themselves into something clearer. Was Sasha getting letters too? Were they about me? The thought made me feel unsteady, like the rules of reality had shifted under my feet. The next time we met up for book club, I watched her carefully, too carefully, probably. I noticed her fidgeting with her bag, pulling a folded slip of paper in and out like she couldn't decide what to do with it. My heart almost stopped. Was that a letter? Had she gotten one about me? I don't know why I didn't say anything. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I didn't want to break whatever spell we were both under. But now, every time I look at her, I wonder, who's writing to her? Are her letters gentle and observant like mine? And if the letters are about me, what do they say? I haven't found another letter yet, but I know it's coming. It always does. And this time, for the first time, I feel like I'm not alone in this. Maybe the letters are guiding us both toward something, toward each other, or maybe they're just the universe's way of making my life feel like a novel I can't quite put down. So, Here's my question. Has anything like this ever happened to anyone else? Has the universe ever slipped you a message so specific it felt like it was meant just for you? Or am I the only one out here receiving handwritten love notes from a ghost I've never met? When I found the box, I wasn't looking for anything in particular. It was wedged in the corner of my grandmother's attic, tucked behind an old sewing table and stacks of moth-eaten blankets. A simple wooden box, unremarkable except for the faint carvings on the lid. Symbols that looked almost like letters but didn't belong to any alphabet I recognized. I sat there, knees aching on the dusty floorboards, staring at it for what felt like a long time before finally brushing away the cobwebs and lifting it into my lap. It was heavier than it looked, the wood cool against my skin despite the stifling heat of the attic. I blew off a layer of dust, the particles swirling in the slants of sunlight filtering through the rafters. No lock, no latch, just the box and me. Inside were marbles. Not the cheap kind I used to lose under the couch as a kid, but marbles unlike any I'd ever seen. Each one was about the size of a ping-pong ball, smooth as glass but alive with shifting colors that moved like oil on water. One was a deep, pulsating blue, the kind of blue that made you think of bottomless oceans. Another shimmered gold, flickering like candlelight caught in a breeze. There were others, emerald green, storm cloud gray, a red so dark it was nearly black. I picked one up, the blue one, and it was cold to the touch, sending a strange tingle up my arm. The swirling colors seemed to speed up, as if responding to me. "What are you?" I muttered aloud, turning it over in my hand. The marble pulsed, and I swear I heard something. A whisper. Not in the room, not through my ears. It was in my head, faint and distant, like a voice calling from the bottom of a well. I froze, gripping the marble so hard it pressed into my palm. The whisper came again, clearer this time, though still faint. "See?" I don't know why I held it to my eye, but I did. Instinct, maybe, or that irresistible curiosity you get when you're standing too close to the edge of something vast and unknowable. The instant I looked through the marble, everything changed. The attic disappeared. I wasn't anywhere. Or maybe I was everywhere. The world had folded into something impossible, a swirling void of blue, and yet I wasn't afraid. It was calm there, quiet, like floating in a dark sea under a starless sky. Then I saw them, shapes moving in the distance. At first, they were just faint outlines, gliding through the void like shadows in deep water. As they came closer, I realized they were people. Or at least, they looked like people. There were dozens of them, their features blurred, their bodies wrapped in faint, glowing light that pulsed in time with something I couldn't hear. They didn't walk or run. They drifted, weightless and slow. One of them turned toward me. I felt its gaze before I saw its face. Empty, hollow eyes staring through me. My stomach lurched, and I pulled the marble away from my eye, gasping like I'd surfaced from drowning. The attic snapped back into focus around me, the sunlight harsh and blinding. My hands were shaking. I looked at the marble again, now just a smooth, motionless blue sphere. No pulsing, no whispers. I slammed the box shut and shoved it back into the corner where I found it, the carved symbols on the lid seeming sharper now, like they were watching me. My grandmother passed away 2 weeks later. Heart attack, they said. It felt wrong to blame a box of marbles for something like that, but I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was in that attic had something to do with it. I tried to forget about the box. I really did. But the whispers didn't stop. They came at night, faint at first, like the sound of wind threading through trees. Soon, they grew louder. Words I couldn't understand, voices I didn't recognize. Sometimes, they sounded like my grandmother calling my name from another room. Sometimes, they sounded like me. One night, I woke up to find the box sitting on my nightstand. I don't know how it got there. I didn't bring it down. I sat up, heart hammering, staring at it in the dark. The symbols on the lid seemed to glow faintly now, a soft, rhythmic pulse like the beating of a heart. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't. But the whispers grew louder, rising in a crescendo until it felt like the room itself was vibrating. When I lifted the lid, the marbles were gone. Instead, there was a mirror. A small, round mirror, no bigger than my palm. Its surface was so smooth and clear it seemed to swallow the light around it. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and turned it toward me. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale, but something was wrong. The me in the mirror didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just looked. Then it smiled. I dropped the mirror with a strangled gasp, but it didn't shatter. It hit the floor with a soft, muffled thud and lay there, face up. The surface now dark and rippling like the surface of a black pond. I watched, paralyzed, as a hand, thin, pale, with long fingers, emerged from the glass. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, my parents were in the doorway, shaking me awake. The mirror was gone. The box was gone. The attic was empty when they went to check. No sewing table, no blankets, just a bare, dusty floor. They told me it was a nightmare. For years, I almost believed them. Almost. I moved out of that house when I turned 18. I never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. The whisper, faint, calling from just behind the walls. See, I try not to listen. I keep the lights on. I don't own mirrors anymore. But last week, a package arrived at my door. No return address. No postage. Just a wooden box, carved with symbols that don't belong to any alphabet I recognize. The first time I saw it, I was halfway through a truly mediocre blind date at the local diner. His name was Brandon, or maybe Brendan. I don't remember because he spent the entire evening talking about his fantasy football league and how it was basically just as strategic as running a Fortune 500 company. I nodded along, sipping my milkshake and wondering how soon was too soon to fake an emergency and leave. And that's when I saw it. In the booth behind him, across the room, there was a door. It wasn't part of the diner's layout. I knew that for a fact because I'd been coming here for years, and the wall it was on used to have a bulletin board with local ads for babysitters and lost pets. Now there was a door. It didn't match the rest of the diner. While everything else was retro, chrome accents, red vinyl booths, checkered floors, the door was sleek and modern, with no handle and a faint glow around its edges. No one else seemed to notice it. The waitstaff walked past like it wasn't there, and the customers didn't even glance at it. Arden? Brandon/Brendan snapped his fingers. You good? Huh. I blinked at him, realizing I'd been staring over his shoulder for way too long. You've got this faraway look, he said, smirking. Is it my fantasy football team? It's impressive, right? Sure, I said, standing abruptly. I'll be right back. I need to bathroom. I didn't even wait for him to respond. I just slid out of the booth and walked toward the door, my heart pounding harder with every step. Up close, it was even stranger. The glow wasn't just light. It pulsed softly, almost like the door was alive. There was no knob, no keyhole, just a smooth surface and a faint, melodic hum. And then it spoke. Would you like to try again? I froze. What? The voice wasn't loud, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, clear and calm. Would you like to try again? I glanced over my shoulder, expecting someone to be staring at me, but the diner carried on as usual. A kid was screaming about chicken fingers. The grill sizzled. Brendan, I think, was taking a selfie with his milkshake. No one cared that I was talking to a door. Try what again? I whispered, leaning closer. The glow brightened, and for a moment, I felt a strange warmth rush through me, a mix of nostalgia and sadness. Memories floated to the surface. Moments I'd botched, choices I regretted, things I wished I could take back. A fight with my best friend that we'd never really recovered from. A job I'd quit too soon because I was scared I'd fail. The time I didn't tell my dad I loved him before he passed. The door hummed louder. Would you like to try again? I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. This was crazy, right? Doors don't just show up in diners and offer you a redo on your worst mistakes. But what if it wasn't crazy? What if it was real? I reached out. My fingers hovered an inch from the surface, and I hesitated. What's the catch? I asked. The door pulsed softly, but the voice didn't answer. Of course, there was a catch. There's always a catch. But the memories weighed on me, heavy and sharp, and the idea of fixing them, of getting a second chance, was intoxicating. Before I could overthink it, I pressed my hand to the door. The diner vanished. One moment, I was standing on a checkered floor that smelled like grease and disappointment, and the next, I was in a quiet, sunlit room that felt eerily familiar. The air was warm, and the faint smell of lavender drifted through the open window. I looked around, and my chest tightened. It was my childhood bedroom. The walls were still painted that terrible shade of purple I'd picked when I was 10. My old posters were tacked up in the same crooked way. On the desk was a math homework sheet with my name written in the top corner, in my 5th grade handwriting. This couldn't be real. Arden. I turned, and there she was. My mom, standing in the doorway, alive and healthy and so much younger than I remembered. Her hair was darker, her smile brighter, and she was holding a plate of cookies like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You've been up here forever," she said, laughing. "Come downstairs. Your dad wants to show you something." My knees almost gave out. I don't even remember moving, but somehow I followed her down the stairs. There he was, my dad, sitting on the couch, fiddling with the remote like he always used to. He looked up when he saw me, his face lighting up in that warm, dad way that I hadn't seen in years. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "You're just in time. Check this out. There's a meteor shower tonight." I stood there, frozen, feeling like I'd been dropped into someone else's life. But it wasn't someone else's. It was mine, a life I thought I'd lost. The door had kept its promise, but as I sat there on the couch, watching the sky with my parents, a nagging thought wormed its way into my mind. What had I traded for this? The next day, I went looking for the door. I searched my bedroom, the basement, even the garage, but it wasn't there. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me somehow, waiting for something. Days turned into weeks. Life felt surreal. I wasn't just reliving memories, I was changing them, fixing things. I said, "I love you" more. I apologized when I needed to. I paid attention in ways I hadn't the first time around. And yet, it didn't feel right. It was too perfect, too easy. One night, weeks into my second chance, I heard the hum, faint but unmistakable. I followed it down the hall, my heart pounding, and found the door waiting for me in the living room. "Time is up," the voice said. "No," I whispered. "I'm not ready." The glow brightened, and the warmth I'd felt before was gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. "You have lived your choice. Now it is ours." I tried to back away, but the door opened, and the glow swallowed everything. When I woke up, I was back in the diner. Brandon/Brendan was gone, replaced by an empty booth. The door was gone, too, and the wall was back to its boring corkboard. Everything looked the same, but something was wrong. I felt lighter, like something had been taken from me. And then I realized what it was. The memories. All the ones I'd tried so hard to fix, the moments I'd relived, they were gone. Not just the bad ones. All of them. My parents, my friends, my childhood. They were blank spaces, faint echoes I couldn't reach no matter how hard I tried. The door had given me my second chance, but it had taken everything else in return. It began with the chair. Not just any chair. A beautiful, sleek, ergonomic monstrosity I had ordered online at 2 a.m. because I'd convinced myself that my back pain could be solved with a credit card and good lumbar support. It arrived 3 days later, accompanied by a string of chirpy notifications. "Your chair is on its way. Your chair has been delivered. Don't forget to unbox your new chair." Unbox it. Like it was a gift. Like this chair and I were about to embark on some romantic comedy where I'd sit down and all my problems would disappear. Spoiler, they didn't. I ripped open the box with the kind of energy usually reserved for Christmas morning. Inside, the chair looked smug, almost glowing under the living room light. Modern curves, all matte black and promises of spinal alignment. It was perfect, except for one detail, the instructions. There were none. Instead, a QR code stared up at me, daring me to scan it. I sighed, pulled out my phone, and complied. That's when the trouble started. A video began to play. Happy music, soft lighting, and a voice that oozed smug serenity. Welcome to the future of sitting. The video promised me that the chair would assemble itself once I followed a few simple app-guided steps. because apparently, even furniture now required Wi-Fi. I downloaded the app, paired it with my chair. Yes, I paired with a chair, and watched as the chair buzzed softly, its frame shuddering like a robot waking up from a long nap. The app pinged, Step 1. Breathe deeply. Your chair is syncing with you. I stared at my phone. Syncing? With me? Okay. I said aloud to no one. That's fine. Totally normal. Step 2 instructed me to sit down and allow the chair to adjust to my unique body structure. Reluctantly, I obeyed. As soon as I sat, the chair let out a low whir, followed by a mechanical hum. I tensed up, fully convinced I'd made a purchase straight out of a sci-fi horror movie. And then the chair spoke. Not out loud, thank God, but via the app. Words popped up on the screen, polite yet disturbingly sentient. Welcome, user. I'm here to support you, literally and emotionally. Let's optimize your posture. I blinked at my phone. Emotionally? You're a chair. Correction. I'm your wellness partner. Wellness partner. A chair. That talks. It began recalibrating itself, small motors inside shifting and adjusting, tilting me upright like a king on a very judgmental throne. I sat there, completely still, as the app sent another notification. Goal achieved. Optimal sitting position unlocked. I half expected confetti to burst out of the armrests. This was all mildly terrifying, but I couldn't deny the chair felt good. Too good. Like it knew me. Like it was quietly whispering, "See? I told you you'd love me." For the next few days, the chair behaved itself. It sat quietly when I wasn't using it, charged its mysterious little motor battery at night, and only occasionally sent encouraging notifications like, "Time for a posture check, friend?" It felt helpful, wholesome even, until one evening, I got home from work to find a new message waiting for me in the app. "You've been sitting less this week. Everything okay?" It was such a loaded question, coming from furniture, no less, that I actually said, "Mind your business," to the empty room. The next day, the chair escalated. I'd been binge watching a show for hours, slumped over in the kind of posture that screams, "I have given up." Suddenly, the chair hummed to life and straightened my spine with the gentle but firm authority of a parent fixing a toddler's seatbelt. "Hey!" I yelped, nearly spilling my popcorn. The app pinged, "Don't slouch. We're better than this." It only got worse from there. The chair started tracking my sitting habits. It buzzed if I stayed seated too long, practically scolding me. "Let's stand up and move around." If I ignored it, it sent a notification to my phone that read, "Prolonged sitting detected. Would you like to set a health goal?" One night, I tried to outsmart it. I sat in a beanbag chair instead, feeling like a medieval king avoiding his advisor. But my phone vibrated anyway. Remember, better posture means a better you. The chair was spying on me. At this point, I was convinced my wellness partner had too much power. I told my friend about it over lunch, half joking, "I think my chair has boundary issues." She laughed and said, "You're being dramatic." Am I? Because the next day, the app notified me of an exciting new feature. Introducing Posture Insights Plus, receive tailored suggestions to optimize your overall wellness. Overall wellness. What does a chair know about my overall wellness? Curious but skeptical, I clicked through. The app greeted me with my weekly sitting report, complete with a line graph of how often I'd sat, how long I'd slouched, and even, get this, how many times I'd appeared stressed. Appeared stressed? I whispered. "What are you basing this on, chair?" A new message popped up. "We're in this together, friend. We are not friends." That was it. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and searched for the app settings. Somewhere in there, I was sure I could turn off the insights or unpair the chair. But the only option I found was, "Are you sure you want to disconnect? This will limit your wellness journey." I hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, you win, but you're on thin ice." It didn't respond, thankfully, but I swear I felt it shift just a little under me, smug and victorious. That's the thing about living in this world. Everything is smart now. My fridge knows my grocery habits, my vacuum sends me emails, and my chair? My chair has opinions about my life choices. It's absurd, it's intrusive, and yet, it's kind of impressive. Because here's the secret. My back does feel better. My posture has improved. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm working on something and the chair gently hums as if to say, "You've got this," I kind of appreciate it. Maybe the machines really do want what's best for us. Or maybe this is just how it starts. Today, they're correcting our posture. Tomorrow? Who knows? All I'm saying is, if my toaster starts offering unsolicited life advice, I'm out. What about you? Has technology ever gotten a little too personal with you? Or is it just me and my overly ambitious chair? The first sign was the fox. I spotted it on a Wednesday morning, just sitting in the middle of the street outside my apartment. Not running, not sniffing around, just sitting like it was waiting for something. Its fur was red, so bright it looked like it had been painted, and its eyes, 2 gold coins, sharp and still, were locked onto me. I watched it through the window, my toothbrush hanging out of my mouth, foam threatening to dribble onto my shirt. It didn't move, just sat there, perfectly still, staring up at me. I don't live in the kind of place where foxes wander out of the woods. I live in the city, concrete and glass for miles. I pressed my face to the glass, half expecting it to vanish like a trick of the light, but it didn't. It blinked, slow and deliberate, as if to say, "I see you," then turned and trotted away down the empty street. I didn't think much of it at first, just one of those weird things you tell your coworkers when you're trying to fill the silence. A fox in the city? Must have gotten lost. But as I walked to work, something felt off. The air was too quiet. Usually, the city roared in the morning. Car horns, construction noise, snippets of conversation. But today, the streets felt muffled, as though someone had draped a blanket over the world. The few people I passed didn't look at me. Not once. They walked in neat, straight lines, eyes forward, feet moving in perfect rhythm, like they were following some silent conductor. I stopped at the crosswalk and glanced around, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. When the light turned green, the entire crowd moved forward at the same time, steps synchronized, their shoes hitting the pavement in unison. My heart skipped. At work, things were normal enough at first. Emails, spreadsheets, the occasional awkward nod in the break room. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd watched too many late-night movies, and the fox had rattled me more than I'd realized. But then, just before lunch, I looked out the window and saw the fox again. It was standing on the sidewalk across the street, staring up at my office. Same red fur, same gold eyes. A delivery guy nearly tripped over it, but the fox didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me through the glass as though it had been waiting all day for me to notice. I turned to the guy in the cubicle next to mine, John, who wore the same 3 ties on rotation, and said, "Do you see that?" He didn't look up. "See what?" "The fox. Down there." I pointed, but when I turned back to the window, the fox was gone. "Never mind," I muttered, my voice small. John didn't reply. I skipped lunch and stayed at my desk, my stomach churning. When I finally left the office that evening, the sky had turned a bruised orange, and the streets were almost empty. I walked faster than usual, listening to the sound of my own footsteps, sharp and echoing against the buildings. I tried to tell myself I was fine, that it had been a long day and I just needed sleep. But as I turned onto my block, I froze. The fox was sitting on the steps of my building, waiting for me. It tilted its head, watching me, and then, this is the part one can never explain, it smiled. Its mouth stretched wider than any animal should, teeth sharp and white against the dark. I stood there, frozen to the spot. My keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they left marks on my palm. The fox blinked once, slow and deliberate, and then it stood and disappeared around the corner, its tail flicking behind it like a brushstroke. I didn't follow it. I went inside, locked my door, and double-checked the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just wrong, broken. That night, I dreamed of hallways. Long, endless hallways lined with doors. Some of the doors were normal, wooden, familiar, but others were wrong. Carved from stone, or shimmering like water, or pulsing faintly as though something inside them was breathing. I walked for hours, the doors stretching into infinity, but I never opened any of them. I was too afraid. At some point, I became aware of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, and inhuman. I didn't dare turn around. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of footsteps still echoing in my ears, and the faint scent of something wild and metallic lingering in my room. The next day, the city had shifted. I can't explain it any better than that. The streets were still there, the buildings still stood, but nothing felt right. The air buzzed like an old TV, and the people, the people, moved like puppets, their faces blank, their eyes glassy. I stopped at the corner to buy a coffee, and when I handed the barista a bill, he didn't blink or smile or move his lips when he said, "Thank you." The voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere else, somewhere behind him, as though the words had been piped in through the speakers of a broken intercom. I dropped the change he gave me, and the coins clattered to the floor in slow motion, ringing louder than they should have. I backed out of the shop without my coffee. I kept walking, my legs shaking, but the world didn't get better. A man stood on the sidewalk ahead, facing the wrong way, his back to the road, his shoulders jerking like he was laughing or crying. A woman stood motionless in the middle of the park, holding a bouquet of wilted flowers and staring at nothing. And there, perched on a newspaper stand, was the fox, watching, smiling. "It's time," it said. I heard the voice clear as day, not through my ears but inside my head, like a memory I'd forgotten I had. The fox tilted its head, eyes burning gold, and nodded towards something behind me. My body moved before I could stop it, turning against my will. There was a door, just like the ones in my dream, tall and dark, shimmering faintly like oil on water. It stood in the middle of the sidewalk where no door had any right to be. The people walking past didn't see it. They just kept moving, sliding around it like it wasn't there, their faces blank and eyes empty. I knew I shouldn't touch it, but I also knew I didn't have a choice. The voice came again, softer this time, almost kind. "It's time." I reached for the handle. It was warm, and as my fingers closed around it, I realized I couldn't hear the city anymore. No footsteps, no cars, no voices. Just silence. The fox was still watching me, waiting, its tail curled neatly around its paws. I pulled the door open, and I stepped through. I don't know where I am now. The sky here is endless, churning with gold and red, the ground beneath my feet like glass. I can see shadows moving in the distance, tall shapes that walk too smoothly, too silently. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, but when I turn, there's nothing there. Every now and then, I see the fox. It doesn't speak anymore. It just watches. I think it's waiting for me to choose a door. There are hundreds here, just like in my dream. Stone, water, wood, light, all stretching into a horizon I can't reach. I don't know where they go. I don't know which one is mine, but the fox seems to know, and I think, one day, it'll tell me. It was the day I found the photograph that everything began to change. I was digging through the back of my kitchen drawer, the one where old batteries, mismatched screws, and expired coupons lived, all jumbled together like a graveyard of forgotten things. I was looking for a rubber band, nothing exciting, when my fingers grazed the corner of something smooth. I pulled it out, expecting another expired gift card, but instead, I held a photograph. It was faded at the edges, its surface warped slightly like it had gotten wet at some point. I turned it over, and there it was, a picture of me. Or at least, it looked like me. In the photograph, I was standing in the middle of a carnival, the kind that only rolls through town for a few nights before disappearing like smoke. Ferris wheels with lights that twinkled like constellations, candy-striped tints leaning slightly as though caught mid-dream. I was in the center of it all, frozen in black and white, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, clutching a balloon that floated limply at my side. My face was expressionless, my eyes locked on the camera with an unsettling stillness. What struck me most, though, was the detail behind me. Far in the background, barely visible, a man in a dark suit standing at the entrance of one of the tents. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me. I don't remember this photograph being taken. I don't remember this dress, this carnival, or that balloon. But the person in the photograph was me. Same nose, same eyebrows, the same little scar under my chin I'd gotten falling off my bike when I was 8. I flipped it over, hoping to find some sort of date or note, but the back was blank. It left a smudge of dust on my fingers, the faint smell of something old and metallic hanging in the air. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I carried it with me from room to room, setting it on the table as I made coffee, glancing at it as I half-heartedly scrolled through emails. By evening, I was pacing my living room, turning the photo over and over in my hands like it might suddenly decide to explain itself. How did it get in my kitchen drawer? Who had taken it? Why couldn't I remember being there? I told myself it was probably a trick of memory, an old photo someone had taken of me as a child, and I'd just forgotten. But the carnival didn't look like any I'd ever been to, and I didn't look like a child. I looked like me, as I was now. That night, I dreamed of the carnival. I stood exactly where I was in the photograph, the air thick with the smell of buttered popcorn and something sickly sweet underneath. The sky above me was deep purple, like twilight caught halfway between day and night, and the carnival stretched out in every direction, larger than it had seemed in the picture. Music played from nowhere, a warped calliope tune that rose and fell like laughter echoing from far away. Around me, the rides moved, but the people were wrong. Their faces blurred as they passed, smudges of gray and shadow that flickered in and out of existence like static on an old television. Then I saw him, the man from the photograph. He stood at the entrance of a candy-striped tent, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his hat tilted just enough to hide his eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply raised his arm and beckoned, a single, slow curl of his gloved finger. I tried to turn around, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I looked down and realized I was holding the same limp balloon from the picture. My fingers burned where it touched them, like the string had been dipped in ice. The man beckoned again. The music grew louder, twisting into something sharp and wrong. I woke up gasping, my sheets tangled around me, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might split open my ribs. The photograph sat on my nightstand, right where I'd left it, but it looked different. The edges were darker, the surface glossier, as though it had been freshly printed. And in the background, the man in the suit was closer to the foreground, his shadow stretching long across the ground. I shoved the photograph back into the kitchen drawer and left it there, burying it under a pile of takeout menus. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night, I returned to the carnival. The rides were louder. The sky was darker. The man in the suit was always there, waiting just outside the tent. Each night, he beckoned. Each night, I refused to move, my limbs frozen with a terror I couldn't explain. By the fourth day, I couldn't focus. The dreams bled into my waking hours. I swore I heard carnival music playing faintly in the distance as I brushed my teeth, the scent of buttery popcorn wafting through my living room even though I hadn't made any. At work, I caught glimpses of striped tints out of the corner of my eye, disappearing when I turned to look. My coworkers' faces seemed strange, their features slightly out of sync, like the people in the carnival crowd. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the photograph out of the drawer and stared at it, shaking. The man in the suit was closer still, just a few feet behind me now, his face obscured by shadow. I knew what I had to do. I don't know how I knew. I just did. I had to go back. That night, I didn't fight the dream. When I found myself standing in the carnival, holding the balloon, I let my feet carry me toward the tent. The man waited, still and silent, his hand outstretched as if offering to guide me. The music faded as I stepped inside, and the world around me dissolved into darkness. There was no carnival anymore. No man. Just silence. When I woke up, it was morning. Bright sunlight streamed through my window, and for the first time in days, I felt like I'd slept deeply. I sat up, glancing toward the nightstand. The photograph was gone. I searched everywhere for it. Under my bed, inside the kitchen drawer, even in the trash, but it had disappeared completely. The air in my apartment felt lighter, as though some invisible weight had been lifted, and the dreams never returned. Weeks passed. I told myself it had all been some strange, prolonged hallucination, the result of stress or bad sleep, or some combination of the two. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear it faintly. A calliope tune playing somewhere far away, just on the edge of hearing. And when I walk downtown, past that same thrift store where the whole thing began, I don't stop. Because sometimes, if I glance at the window out of the corner of my eye, I see a candy-striped tint reflected in the glass, and a man in a dark suit standing just outside it, watching, waiting. The day began when I found a hole in the middle of my living room floor. Not a crack, not a stain, a hole, perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, cut clean through my floorboards. It shouldn't have been there. I rent this apartment. It's the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happens. Beige walls, cheap carpeting, neighbors who microwave fish at 2 a.m. But this hole was new. I crouched down and peered into it, expecting to see pipes or dirt or, I don't know, something beneath the floor. Instead, I saw nothing. And by nothing, I mean a depth so black it looked hungry, like it might swallow the light and keep chewing. I waved my hand over the hole, expecting, what? A breeze? The smell of mold? There was nothing, just silence and shadow. I sat back on my heels, brain flipping through possible explanations. Sinkhole? Trick of perspective? Weird hallucination brought on by too much caffeine? But then something happened that made the world tilt sideways. Something moved inside the hole. It was quick, just a flicker, a shadow shifting against shadows. I flinched, scrambling back so fast I knocked over a lamp. My heart pounded in my throat as I stared at the hole, waiting for it to, I don't know, do something. But it sat there, still and unbothered, like it hadn't just blinked at me. I told myself to leave it alone. I told myself holes don't just appear, and I probably needed a good nap. But an hour later, I was still sitting cross-legged on the carpet, staring at it. Then I made the first mistake. I dropped something into it. It wasn't much, just a penny I found in the couch cushions. I figured it would bounce off the bottom, or at least make a noise as it hit whatever was down there. Instead, the penny vanished, swallowed up without a sound. I leaned closer. Hello? I whispered, and immediately felt ridiculous. But then a voice whispered back, hello. I shot to my feet so fast I nearly fell over. The voice was faint, distorted, like it was coming through a busted speaker. It didn't sound menacing, just tired. Who's there? I said, staring into the darkness. The voice didn't answer. Instead, something drifted up from the hole, like smoke, but thicker, heavier, curling around itself as it rose. It swirled lazily in the air before solidifying into an object and dropping onto the carpet with a soft thud. It was the penny, except now it was wrong. The edges were sharper, more jagged, and the image stamped into it wasn't Lincoln's face anymore. It was a shape I couldn't make sense of, a spiral twisting inward, pulling at my vision the longer I stared at it. I backed away, suddenly cold all over. Nope, I muttered. Nope, nope, nope. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, slamming the door behind me. The hole was still there when I returned that evening, and it was bigger. Not much, just a few inches wider, but enough to notice. The edges of it had started fraying, like the floorboards themselves were unraveling. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, knelt by the hole, and shined the beam straight into it. The light didn't go far. It hit something about 10 feet down, a surface that seemed to ripple like liquid. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it. A hand, not reaching out, not waving, just resting against the rippling surface, as if someone was pressing their palm lightly against a glass window. It was pale and unmoving, its fingers long and too perfectly shaped, like something imitating a human hand but getting the details just slightly wrong. I dropped the flashlight. The beam spun wildly as it clattered against the floor, but before I could grab it, the light blinked out. The hole swallowed it whole. I sat there, frozen, staring at the darkness. That's when the voice came again, soft and close, as though someone were whispering directly into my ear. Let me in. A chill spread through my body like ice water in my veins. I scrambled backward until my back hit the wall. What are you? I choked out. There was a long silence, and then the voice replied, so quietly I almost couldn't hear it. Lonely. The word lingered in the air, heavy and sad, and against all logic, my fear cracked just slightly. I didn't understand what was happening, but I could feel something on the other side of that hole. Something that had been there a long, long time. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Company," it said. The room felt colder now, and I realized the edges of the hole were still growing. The wood curled and splintered as the darkness bled outward, slow but steady, like ink spreading across paper. I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the door, but when I yanked it open, the hallway outside wasn't there anymore. The hallway was gone. In its place was a vast, black void. I stumbled back into the apartment, slamming the door shut. My breath came fast and shallow as I turned to face the hole. It was larger now, easily the size of a manhole cover. The air in the room felt heavy, like the gravity had shifted. I heard something shift in the darkness, a shuffling, like fabric dragging over stone. And then, slowly, something began to rise. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It had the vague shape of a person, but its limbs were too long, its body covered in folds of shadow that billowed like smoke. Its head tilted to one side as it emerged, the shape of its face rippling like water, never settling into a single form. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure stepped fully out of the hole, its feet landing soundlessly on the floor. It stood there for a moment, studying me with an unreadable expression, and then it did the strangest thing of all. It sat down, cross-legged on the carpet, like it was perfectly at home. The shadows surrounding it softened slightly, and when it spoke again, its voice was gentle. "I won't hurt you," it said. "I just want to be seen." I stared at it, my chest heaving. The hole on the floor had stopped growing. The edges of it were smooth now, perfectly round again, as if the creature had finished whatever it needed to do. "What are you?" I whispered. "A visitor," it replied simply. We sat there for what felt like hours, me and the shadow. It didn't move. It didn't speak again. It just was. And somehow, that was worse than if it had lunged at me or screamed, or done anything at all. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the hole was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No damage to the floor, no trace of shadow. My flashlight was sitting on the counter, perfectly intact. But I wasn't alone. The figure was still there, curled silently in the corner of the room, watching me with shifting, unreadable eyes. And now, every time I look into a dark space, an open closet, an empty hallway, I see something move. I see it waiting. The stars were wrong. Elias noticed it on the third night after the storm. The sky above their little village had always been familiar, a blanket of constellations he could trace with his eyes closed. Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, the North Star. But now, they weren't there. The sky was still full of stars, but they were scattered in strange, shifting patterns, like someone had thrown a handful of glitter into an abyss. "Looks different, doesn't it?" said the old man in the tavern, his voice low and rough like gravel. He sat in the corner, his coat patched with so many layers it was hard to tell what it was made of. That storm blew through and took more than trees and roofs. It cracked the sky. "Cracked it?" Elias asked, his drink halfway to his lips. The man grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "You think I'm mad. That's fine. But you've felt it, haven't you? The pull?" Elias set down his mug. He had felt it, a strange tugging at the edge of his mind, like something calling to him from far away. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not even his sister, Mara. It was the kind of thing people would whisper about, the kind of thing that could make you an outsider. But hearing the old man say it out loud made his skin crawl. "Where's it coming from?" Elias asked quietly. The old man's grin faded. He pointed a crooked finger toward the mountains, where the storm had seemed to linger the longest. Beyond the woods, where the world gets thin. Elias didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the wrong stars through his window, feeling the pull grow stronger. By dawn, he couldn't take it anymore. He packed a small bag, bread, water, a knife, and slipped out of the house before Mara woke up. The forest beyond the village had always been dense, full of twisting paths that led nowhere. But this time, it felt different. The trees were too still, their branches frozen mid-sway, as though afraid to move. Elias walked quickly, the pull at his chest growing with each step, as though an invisible thread had looped around his heart and was tugging him forward. After hours of walking, he reached the clearing. It wasn't supposed to be there. He'd played in these woods as a child and had never seen this place before. In the center of the clearing was a lake, perfectly circular and perfectly black. It didn't ripple in the breeze. It didn't reflect the trees or the sky. It was like a hole in the world. Elias crouched at the edge of the water, his breath shallow. The pull was unbearable now, like he was standing too close to a cliff's edge. "What are you?" he whispered. The lake answered. A ripple spread across its surface, slow and deliberate, and Elias saw something rise. A shape, dark and massive, just beneath the water. He stumbled back, his heart hammering as the surface began to part. The figure that emerged was tall, impossibly tall, draped in robes that seemed to be made of the night itself. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but when it turned toward Elias, he felt it looking through him. "You came," the figure said. Its voice was not one voice, but many, layered and resonant, echoing in Elias's bones. Elias swallowed hard. "I don't know why I came." The figure raised a hand, long and thin, its skin the color of shadows. "You were called. Your world is unraveling." Elias stared at it, his mind spinning. "What do you mean, unraveling?" "The storm," the figure said. "It did not come from here. It tore a seam, a thin place between your world and others. And now the sky bleeds truths it should not hold." Elias glanced at the lake again, its surface quivering faintly like a living thing. "Can it be fixed?" The figure tilted its head, the shadow of its face deepening. "That depends on you." "Me?" Elias backed up a step. I'm no one." "You are enough," the figure said simply. Then it extended its hand, palm up. A tiny shard of glass lay there, glowing faintly with a silvery light. "Take this." Elias hesitated, the hum of the wrong stars buzzing faintly in his ears. "What is it?" "The last piece of your sky." The shard pulsed gently in the figure's hand, and Elias couldn't look away. His fingers itched to hold it, though every instinct screamed at him to run. He took a shaky breath, then reached forward and picked it up. The moment it touched his skin, everything shifted. The forest disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of silver mist. He stood on nothing, surrounded by nothing, but he could see glimpses of his world in the distance, floating shards like pieces of a shattered mirror. The village, the woods, the stars, now even more fractured, like they were falling apart. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The in-between," the figure said, its voice now coming from all directions. "The seam must be mended, or your world will fall through." Elias stared at the shard in his hand, its glow brighter now, more urgent. "How do I fix it?" "Find the center," the voice said, "and return the shard." "Where is the center?" "You already know." Elias looked down at the shard again, and realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The pull, the thread tied around his heart, was leading him back to the lake. The mist around him began to shift, pulling him forward. He stumbled, then ran, the ground reforming under his feet with every step. Trees rose up around him, and the black lake appeared ahead, its surface now churning violently, as though the world itself was trying to swallow it. Elias didn't stop. He sprinted to the water's edge, the pull now a force of its own, dragging him forward. The shard in his hand burned, and as the lake began to rise like a dark wave, he threw it. The shard arced through the air and hit the water. There was no splash. Instead, the lake froze, its surface going perfectly still. The hum stopped. The pull was gone. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then the sky above him shifted. Elias looked up, his chest heaving. The stars were rearranging themselves, flowing back into the patterns he knew, like someone was putting the pieces of a puzzle back in place. Orion, the Dipper, the North Star. The wrongness faded, replaced by something that felt whole again. The figure was gone. The lake was gone. In their place was an empty clearing, quiet and ordinary. Elias stood there, trying to catch his breath, until the first light of dawn began to bleed through the trees. The stars winked out, one by one, leaving only the promise of daylight. When he returned to the village, no one noticed he had been gone. The old man in the tavern wasn't there. The storm, they said, had been a freak accident, nothing more. Elias didn't argue. That night, he stood outside his house and looked up at the stars. They were exactly as they should be, perfect and steady. But deep in his chest, he could still feel it, a faint, silvery pull, as if the seam he had mended might one day stretch thin again. And when it did, he knew it would call for him. It all began with the rain. Not the soft, poetic kind of rain that makes you want to curl up with a book, but the heavy, pounding kind that turns streets into rivers and drowns out the sound of your thoughts. It had been falling for hours, and I was starting to wonder if it would ever stop when something odd happened. My phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "Come outside. It's time." I blinked at the screen, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no sane person would be standing out in this storm. I sent back a quick wrong number and figured that was the end of it. But then came another buzz. "The rain is your invitation. Don't make us wait." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I looked out the window, expecting to see some prankster in a raincoat. Instead, the street was empty, except for a single umbrella, upright and perfectly still in the middle of the road. I should have ignored it. A smart person would have ignored it. Instead, I grabbed my coat and opened the door. The second I stepped outside, the rain stopped. Just like that. It didn't fade. It didn't slow. One moment, I was stepping into a downpour. The next, everything was still and silent. The sky above was dark, thick with swirling clouds, but not a single drop fell. And the umbrella was still there. It wasn't an ordinary umbrella. It was tall and old-fashioned, with a handle carved to look like a raven's head. As I got closer, I realized there was something tied to it, a small, leather-bound book dangling from a string. I reached out cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage, but my fingers closed around it. The moment I touched the book, the world shifted. It's hard to describe what it felt like. Like my body had suddenly fallen out of sync with itself, as if I was being pulled apart and stitched back together in the same breath. I stumbled, gripping the umbrella for balance, and when I looked up, everything had changed. The street was no longer the street. The buildings around me were gone, replaced by endless rows of enormous trees with bark as black as coal and branches that reached into the sky like bony fingers. The ground beneath my feet was soft, covered in thick moss that seemed to glow faintly, and the air was alive with a quiet hum, like the earth itself was breathing. I turned around, but the door to my apartment and everything else I knew was gone. I looked down at the book still clutched in my hand. Its cover was blank, but the pages were filled with writing. Strange, looping letters that moved on their own, like ink sliding across glass. The first line of text stopped moving long enough for me to read it. "Follow the lanterns." I looked up and saw them, small, glowing orbs of light hovering between the trees. They bobbed gently, like they were waiting for me to move. So I did. The forest was silent except for my footsteps and the occasional rustle of unseen things in the underbrush. I tried not to think about what they might be. The lanterns led me deeper into the woods, the glow growing brighter and more intense as I went. I don't know how long I walked, minutes, hours? Time didn't seem to matter here. Eventually, the trees parted, and I found myself standing in front of a house. It wasn't a house, really. It was a tower, spiraling up into the sky like it was trying to reach the clouds. The stones were dark and ancient, covered in ivy that glowed the same faint green as the moss. There was a door at the base, made of iron and etched with symbols that pulsed softly, as though the tower itself was alive. The book in my hand buzzed gently, like it was urging me forward. I pushed open the door. Inside was a circular room filled with shelves. Shelves upon shelves of books, scrolls, jars of ink, and things I couldn't even begin to name. In the center of the room was a table, and on that table sat a teapot, 2 cups, and a man. Or at least, he looked like a man at first. He was tall and impossibly thin, His limbs a little too long, his skin a little too pale. His face was sharp, all angles and shadows, and his eyes. His eyes were golden, like the lanterns that had guided me here. He smiled when he saw me, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "You're late," he said, pouring tea into the empty cups. I blinked. "I don't even know where I am." "You're where you're supposed to be," he replied smoothly. "Sit." Against my better judgment, I did. The tea in my cup was a deep, shimmering blue, like liquid night. "Drink," he said. I stared at the cup. "Why?" His smile widened. "Because you're part of the story now." "What story?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. The man tapped the table, and the book I'd been carrying flipped itself open. The ink began to slide across the pages again, forming words as I watched. This time, they weren't strange symbols. They were names. My name. Over and over again. "This isn't possible," I whispered. "Oh, it's very possible," the man said, leaning back. "You just don't remember how you got here yet." I looked at him sharply. "Got here from where?" "From my apartment." He laughed softly, and the sound echoed, like the room itself was laughing with him. "No, from the story you left unfinished. That's the price of curiosity, you see. When you open a door, you become part of the tale." I stood abruptly. "I don't want to be part of anything. I just want to go home." The man's golden eyes locked on mine, and for a second, the room seemed to darken. "Home? This is home now." "No," I said, backing toward the door. "No, it's not." The man watched me, amused, as I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. But outside, the forest was gone. There was nothing beyond the threshold, just an endless void of swirling mist, stretching in all directions. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You can't go back," the man said softly. "Not yet. You haven't finished the story." The book on the table flipped its pages, faster and faster, and the ink began to form something new. "A map. You're going to need that," the man said. "Why?" I whispered. "Because the story isn't over," he replied, his voice echoing with finality. "And the next chapter is yours to write." I looked back at the book, the map glowing faintly on its pages. Paths stretched out into impossible places, twisting and curling like tendrils of smoke. And outside the tower, somewhere deep in the mist, I could hear it. The sound of footsteps, and they were getting closer. When I woke up, my shadow was gone. At first, I didn't notice. It was early, and the light streaming through my window had the pale, sleepy quality of dawn. I stretched, rubbed my eyes, and shuffled to the bathroom to brush my teeth. It wasn't until I looked in the mirror that I realized something was wrong. My reflection was fine. Disheveled hair, tired eyes, same old me. But on the floor behind me, there was nothing. No shadow, no dark outline mimicking my movements, no familiar shape stretching away from the light. Just empty space. "Okay," I said aloud, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's weird." I waved my hand experimentally, watching my reflection do the same. But the floor remained blank. My shadow was just gone. I spent the next 10 minutes pacing around my apartment, trying to figure out what could have caused it. Bad lighting? A weird angle? A trick of the mind? None of it made sense. Every object in the room cast a shadow. The furniture, the plants, even the stack of dishes I'd been avoiding. But not me. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I'd convinced myself I was hallucinating. Lack of sleep. Maybe. Stress. Too much caffeine. I grabbed a glass of water, took a deep breath, and tried to act normal. That's when the knock came. It wasn't at the front door. It was at the window. My stomach dropped. I live on the 7th floor. Heart pounding. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a bird or a branch or some other mundane explanation. Instead, I saw it. My shadow. It was standing outside the window, pressed against the glass. The outline of its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. It was dark, darker than any shadow I'd ever seen, with no texture or depth, just an inky void in the shape of me. I froze, the glass of water trembling in my hand. "What?" I whispered, my throat dry. "What the hell?" The shadow raised its hand, or whatever it had instead of a hand, and knocked again. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like knuckles rapping on a door. It was waiting for me. "Nope," I said, backing away. "Nope, nope, nope." I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but the screen was black, dead, not just off, but completely unresponsive. I glanced at the clock on the wall, only to realize that it had stopped ticking. The air around me felt heavier, like it was pressing in on all sides. The shadow knocked a third time. This time, the glass rattled. I don't know why I went to the window. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but walk closer. But there was something magnetic about it, something I couldn't resist. When I was just a foot away, the shadow stepped back, giving me a better look. It was exactly my shape, my height, my posture, my everything, but it moved wrong. Its gestures were fluid and too quick, like a poorly animated video skipping frames. It pointed at me, then at the lock on the window. "You want me to let you in?" I said, my voice shaking. The shadow nodded. "Not happening." It didn't react. Instead, it reached out and traced a circle on the glass. Wherever its finger, or whatever it was, touched, the glass began to shimmer, the surface warping as though it were melting. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. "Wait, stop." The shadow froze, its featureless head tilting again. I don't know why I said what I said next. Maybe I was stalling. Maybe I thought I could reason with it. Or maybe some part of me just needed answers. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, it pressed its palm against the glass. The warped surface rippled outward, and I heard a sound, a faint whisper, like a dozen voices speaking in unison. "Give me your place," it said. "My place." I repeated, my voice barely audible. The shadow nodded again, its movements sharp and deliberate. "You can't just take it," I said, backing away further. "This is my life." The whispers grew louder, rising into a chaotic, overlapping chorus. The air in the room seemed to pulse with each word. "You abandoned me," the voices hissed. "Left me to rot in your wake. You think you're whole without me? You think you can live free of shadows? I don't even know what you are." I shouted. "I am what you buried," it said, and this time, the words felt like they were inside my head. "The parts of you you were too afraid to face. The lies, the regrets, the truths. I am the darkness you denied, and now I am owed my place." "No," I said firmly, clutching the edge of the counter. "You're not real. You're just some nightmare, a hallucination. I don't owe you anything." The shadow leaned closer to the glass, its outline warping, twisting. "Then I will take it by force." Before I could react, the shadow plunged its hand into the glass. The surface shattered, not outward, but inward, the shards dissolving into black mist. The shadow began to pour into the room, its inky form spreading across the floor like spilled ink. I ran. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock, but the handle wouldn't budge. The entire apartment seemed to twist and shift, the walls growing darker, the air growing colder. "Face me," the shadow hissed, its voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Or fade away." I turned, my back pressed against the door, as the shadow loomed before me. Its form was no longer confined to my shape. It was massive now, a swirling vortex of darkness with glimmers of light flickering in its depths, like stars swallowed by a black hole. "Fine," I shouted, my voice breaking. "You want me to face you? Here I am. What do you want me to do?" The shadow stopped, its swirling form stilling. Then it spoke, its voice quieter now, almost gentle. "Take me back," it said. I hesitated. "Back where?" "Into you," it said simply. A lump formed in my throat. "What happens if I don't?" "You will fade," it said. "An incomplete thing, unmoored. You cannot live without your shadow." I stared at it, at the swirling darkness that seemed so alien and yet so familiar. Slowly, I stepped forward. The shadow reached out, and as its hand touched mine, the world exploded into light. For a moment, I felt everything, the anger, the The fear, the guilt, the longing. Every part of myself I tried to hide, to bury, to forget. It was overwhelming, but it wasn't unbearable. When the light faded, the room was quiet again. I looked down and saw my shadow, stretched out on the floor behind me, just as it should be. But I felt different, heavier, whole. So here's my question. If your shadow came to life and demanded to be let back in, would you face it? Or would you run, knowing you could never escape what's already a part of you? It began with a knock on my door at exactly 3:33 a.m. I live alone, in a third-floor apartment where no one visits unannounced, let alone at a time usually reserved for nightmares and overthinking. I was awake, of course, scrolling on my phone in bed, wrapped in a blanket cocoon, pretending that I could drift off at any moment. The knock was soft but deliberate. 3 raps, a pause, 3 more. I froze, every inch of me convinced it was a dream, a trick of the pipes, or some very polite poltergeist. But then it came again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I dragged myself out of bed, heart pounding. Who's there? I called through the door, my voice embarrassingly small. Silence. I checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty hallway bathed in dull, flickering light. My fingers hovered over the lock. Every rational thought screamed, "Don't open it," but something tugged at me. A pull, faint but undeniable, like a string tied around my ribs. Against my better judgment, I slid the chain back, turned the deadbolt, and cracked the door open just a hair. There, on the welcome mat, sat a box. It was small and square, wrapped in dark green paper that shimmered faintly, like there were flecks of gold in it. A ribbon tied it neatly, holding an envelope in place with my name written across it in swirling black ink. No address, no return label, just my name. I poked my head into the hallway, still empty, and scooped up the box like it might bite me. I locked the door and brought it to the kitchen table, staring at it under the weak glow of the overhead light. "Someone's messing with me," I muttered. But curiosity is a louder voice than reason. I tore open the envelope first. Inside was a card with the same elegant handwriting. Inside is one. You may ask it 3 questions. Do not ask it a 4th. Do not forget what you hear. That's it. No signature. No explanation. My hands itched as I pulled at the ribbon and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was the coin. It was larger than a quarter, roughly the size of my palm, and made of some kind of metal that gleamed even in the dim light. On one side, there was a face, smooth and expressionless, its eyes closed like it was dreaming. On the other side was a single word etched into the surface: yes. I turned it over and over in my hands, convinced this was some prank, but the metal felt impossibly cold, even as it absorbed the heat of my palms. Something about it hummed faintly, like the low buzz of a power line, a sound just below hearing. "One," I whispered, remembering the card. What did it mean? 1 what? And then I did something stupid. I asked the coin a question. I didn't think it would work, mind you. I wasn't expecting magic. I was just indulging the strangeness of the moment, a 3:45 a.m. brain running on too little sleep and too much curiosity. Is this some kind of joke? I asked aloud. The coin pulsed. Not physically, not visibly, but I felt it, like something had clicked into place. Then, a voice answered. It wasn't a voice I heard with my ears. It was inside my head, smooth and deep, the words curling through my mind like smoke. No. I dropped the coin. It clattered onto the table, spinning wildly before settling face up with the dreaming face staring back at me. I sat there, breathless, waiting for my heart to calm down. It wasn't possible. I'd imagined it, right? But the pull was there again, a faint tugging at my thoughts. My skin prickled. "Okay," I whispered, picking the coin up again. "Do you answer any question?" The hum returned, a vibration running through my fingertips and up my arms. Yes. The answer rolled through my mind with the weight of inevitability, like it had always been there, and the coin had simply pointed it out. My stomach flipped. I leaned back in my chair, staring at it. 2 questions. I'd asked 2 questions. 3 questions, the card had said. 3 questions were allowed. But what could I ask? My mind raced through possibilities. What happens when you die? What's the meaning of life? But those questions seemed too big, too far removed from me. I needed something personal, something real. I took a deep breath. Will I ever be happy? The coin seemed to glow in my palm. Faint, like the light was coming from somewhere deep inside. The voice returned. Yes. It should have been a relief, but instead, dread coiled in my chest. There was something strange about the answer, the way the word echoed and lingered, like the creak of a door left swinging open. And then it hit me. 3 questions. I had asked 3, but now I had another. The moment the thought formed, I felt the pull again, sharper this time, a hunger that wasn't mine. What if I ask it a 4th? I picked up the card, my hands shaking, reading the warning over and over. Do not ask it a 4th. But the question gnawed at me. It whispered in my ear, slid beneath my skin. What happens if I do? I didn't want to know. I didn't. But I couldn't stop myself. The question slipped out of my mouth before I could swallow it back. What happens if I ask a 4th question? The coin went silent. The hum vanished. The air seemed to still, as though the world itself had stopped to listen. And then the voice came back, sharper than before. You are ours now. The coin burned in my hand. I yelped and dropped it, but when it hit the table, it didn't stop, it sank. The surface of the wood rippled like water, swallowing the coin whole, leaving only the faint smell of smoke in its wake. My apartment was silent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty spot where the coin had been. My hand still tingled, a faint buzzing beneath my skin. I thought about the words, "You are ours now," and what they might mean. I don't sleep much anymore. Not because of nightmares, but because of the whispers. They started the next night. Faint at first, just a murmur in the back of my mind. Then louder. The voice sounds like the coin. It tells me things I don't want to hear, things I can't forget. Sometimes, it answers questions I didn't ask. Sometimes, it just laughs. I keep my lights on at night now. I don't check my door when someone knocks. And I never, ever ask questions I don't want answered. Have you ever been warned about something and ignored it anyway? This morning, I woke up with someone knocking. Not at the door. Not even on the window. It was coming from inside my head. Knock, knock, knock. Persistent. Rhythmic. Like whoever, or whatever, was in there had been trying to get my attention for years and just now decided to pound on the walls of my brain like a locked tenant demanding a refund. At first, I thought it was a migraine, a weirdly artistic one, because as I blinked against the sunlight, little words began scrolling across the ceiling like the opening credits of a movie. Good morning. You're late. I bolted upright. Late for what? I asked aloud, because when you wake up with the ceiling sending you cryptic messages, you either commit to the crazy or you curl up and hope it passes. The knocking in my head stopped. A voice, small, sharp, impatient, cleared its throat from somewhere behind my eyes. Finally, I thought I'd have to send another memo. I froze, my pulse thudding in my ears. Who said that? Me, said the voice. I'm you, or a version of you. A better version, honestly, but let's not split hairs this early in the day. What? I managed, which felt inadequate given the circumstances. You wouldn't know me, the voice continued matter-of-factly, because you've spent your whole life ignoring me. But now that the door's unlocked, we might as well talk. What door? The door. The one in your head. It's open now. You left it ajar last night. It's fine. It happens. But that means, the voice paused, as though for dramatic effect, you're going to start seeing things. Before I could reply, my bedroom window opened itself, just flung up as though the wind had hands. And that's when I saw him. A man? No, more like a silhouette, a dark figure stitched together with moving lines, like shadows and handwriting mashed into a human shape, stood on my lawn, his head tilted up toward my window. From the way his form rippled, I could tell he was smiling. He waved with an elegant, ink-dripping hand. Ah, said the voice inside me, he's here already. That's a little faster than I expected. Who is that? I whispered. Oh, you know, the voice said breezily. He's from the between. The Between? You really need to keep up? The shadowy figure raised one hand and gestured lazily, like he was flipping through invisible pages. Suddenly, the air in my room grew heavy, as though someone had poured honey into it. My curtains rippled inward, and I swear I heard whispers, hundreds of them, rising from the cracks in the floorboards. "You're being summoned," the voice in my head said, sounding bored. "It's probably about time you saw what's in the between anyway. You've been ignoring it for ages." "I don't want to go to the between," I hissed through clenched teeth, half expecting the shadow man to hear me. "Choice doesn't matter now," the voice said. "You left the door open. You're already halfway through." I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen was just blank. Not dead, not frozen, just a smooth, empty slate of glass. "It won't work," the voice said. "Technology doesn't handle the between well. Too many frequencies. You'll see soon enough." And then my closet door opened. It didn't creak or swing. It peeled open, the wood folding back like paper being torn away. Behind it, there wasn't a closet at all. No clothes, no shelves. Just a yawning, ink-black tunnel filled with shifting lights, gold, silver, and blue, like stars colliding in slow motion. The voice hummed approvingly. "Well, that's convenient. He's giving you a shortcut." "Shortcut to what?" I shouted, but no one answered because now the figure was at the base of my stairs. He hadn't walked. He'd just arrived. His outline jittered like bad reception on an old TV, and now I could hear him speaking. Only, he wasn't using words. The sounds he made were more like ink droplets hitting water, soft splashes, spreading into faint ripples that carried meaning. I understood him, even though he wasn't speaking a language I knew. "You're late. We need you now." "Nope," I said, scrambling back toward the bed like it would help. "I'm not going anywhere." The air warped, and suddenly Juniper, my smug, always indifferent cat, sauntered out of the closet tunnel. Only she wasn't Juniper anymore. She stood on two legs, her shadow elongated and strange, like she was stitched together from fabric and dreams. A pair of gold spectacles perched on her nose, and a tiny pocket watch dangled from a chain around her neck. "Are you seriously resisting this?" she said, her voice exactly as exasperated as it had been every morning when I forgot to feed her. "We don't have time for your dramatics. The between is waiting." "You're a cat," I shouted, pointing at her. "I'm also an assistant archivist," she said dryly, adjusting her glasses. "Come on, before he gets impatient." I turned toward the window. The shadow figure was now just outside, pressed flat against the glass like a handprint on a fogged mirror. His voice rippled again, words without sound. "Hurry, the story is unraveling." "What story?" I yelled back. Juniper, Archivist Juniper, apparently, grabbed my ankle with a velvet paw hand. "Your story. It's falling apart at the edges." "Falling apart?" Juniper sighed dramatically, yanking me closer to the closet tunnel. "You humans are so literal. Stories don't just sit inside books. They're alive. You're alive. But sometimes the edges fray, and the between has to stitch them back together. Now move." Against my will, or maybe with it, I couldn't tell anymore. I stumbled toward the tunnel. The ink-black air rippled as I stepped inside, the lights spinning faster. My stomach flipped sideways. Juniper trotted ahead of me, her glasses gleaming. "You'll get used to the feeling," she called over her shoulder. I turned back just once and saw my bedroom behind me, shrinking like it was being sucked through the eye of a needle. The shadow man stood in the center of it, watching me leave. Then the tunnel sealed shut, and the world flipped. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in a vast library that stretched into infinity. The shelves were filled with books that pulsed faintly, like heartbeats. Some were open, their pages spinning midair as words leaked out like smoke. "What is this place?" I whispered. Juniper adjusted her spectacles and smiled, a sharp, knowing grin. "Welcome to the between," she said. "You're officially part of the repair crew now." "The what?" "Reality," Juniper said, patting a glowing book with her paw hand, "isn't as stable as you think. Someone's got to keep the story stitched together. That someone is now you." I stared at her. then at the endless library, then back at her. She sighed again. You'll figure it out, or you'll unravel completely. Either way, it'll be interesting. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I laughed. Because isn't that the whole point of stories? To unravel, just a little, and see what's waiting underneath? So, tell me, if the edges of your reality started to fray, would you pull at the thread? Or would you tie it up neatly and pretend you didn't see? Because I think I've already pulled too hard, and now I can't look away. The phone started ringing at 2:13 a.m., pulling me from a dream I couldn't remember. At first, I thought I imagined it, the sound sharp and insistent against the muffled silence of my apartment. It wasn't my cell, it was the landline, the one I didn't even remember plugging in, the one I hadn't used in years. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the blinking red light on the base of the phone. It shouldn't have been ringing. It wasn't even connected to the wall. Still, it didn't stop. Ring after ring, like a pulse growing louder in my ears, daring me to pick it up. After what felt like an eternity, I reached for the receiver, my hand shaking. The moment I touched it, the ringing stopped. Hello? I whispered, my voice dry and cracking in the stillness. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end, deep and hollow, like standing at the mouth of a cave. Then a voice, soft, low, and somehow familiar. It's time, the voice said. A chill ran down my spine. Who is this? You know who, the voice replied, almost amused. I opened my mouth to argue, to demand an explanation, but before I could say anything, the line went dead. The click echoed in the quiet room, louder than it should have been. I stared at the receiver in my hand, the faint smell of static clinging to the air, and then hung it back up. It wasn't until I turned around that I saw it. The mirror on the far wall of my bedroom, a cheap, full-length thing I'd propped up and forgotten, wasn't reflecting my room. Instead, it showed a hallway bathed in faint, flickering light. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the wooden floorboards gleamed as though wet. At the end of the hallway stood a single door, slightly ajar, a warm, golden light spilling out from within. I blinked, convinced I was still dreaming, but the image didn't waver. The mirror rippled faintly, like the surface of a pond disturbed by the gentlest breeze. I stepped closer, the air around me growing colder with every step. Don't, I whispered to myself, but my body didn't listen. When I reached the mirror, I extended a hand, my fingers trembling. The glass wasn't cold or hard. It was soft, pliable, like the surface of water. Before I could pull back, it grabbed me. Something unseen. Something that yanked me forward with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the hallway. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The flickering light came from sconces on the walls, their flames struggling against an unseen wind. Behind me, the mirror was gone. Ahead of me, the door waited. I didn't want to walk toward it, but my legs moved on their own, each step slow and deliberate, like I was being guided. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The golden light spilling out from the crack was warm, inviting, but there was something beneath it, a faint shadow that shifted, moving in time with my breath. I pushed the door open. Inside was a room that felt familiar. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a fire crackled in the stone hearth. 2 chairs sat before the fire, one empty, the other occupied. The person in the chair turned to face me, and my stomach dropped. It was me, not a younger version, not an older one. Me, exactly as I was now. But the eyes, they weren't mine. They were too dark, too deep, like staring into the void. The other me smiled faintly, gesturing to the empty chair. Sit, they said. I didn't move. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. This, they said, gesturing to the room, the fire, the walls, is yours. A collection of the choices you didn't make. The words hit me like a blow, leaving me breathless. What are you talking about? The other me stood, moving with a grace that felt alien in my own body. They walked to one of the shelves, their fingers brushing over the spines of the books. Each one was blank, its cover smooth and featureless. "You think you've lived a single life," they said, their tone soft but sharp. "But every choice you made left others behind. Left them behind." They turned to face me, holding a single book in their hands. "Would you like to see?" Before I could answer, they opened the book. The room disappeared. I was standing in the middle of a park, one I didn't recognize. The sky was overcast, the wind biting at my skin. Ahead of me, a version of myself sat on a bench, laughing with someone. A woman I didn't know but felt like I should. Her face was bright, full of life, and the way she looked at the other me made my chest ache. "This is who you could have been," the voice said, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. "If you hadn't been afraid to say yes." The scene shifted. Now I was standing in an office, watching another version of myself shake hands with someone in a sleek suit. Papers littered the desk, each one bearing a logo I didn't recognize. "This is who you could have been," the voice continued, "if you hadn't been afraid to take the risk." The scenes came faster now. Me on a stage, playing guitar to a roaring crowd. Me holding a child, their tiny hand wrapped around my finger. Me standing alone on a mountaintop, the sun rising behind me. Each life felt like mine and yet impossibly distant, like memories from a dream I'd forgotten. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I was back in the room. The other me stood in front of me, their expression unreadable. "You can take one," they said, holding out the book. "What?" "One choice," they said, their voice gentle now. "One path. You can take it, and it will become yours. But only one." I stared at the book, its blank cover seeming to pulse faintly in the firelight. My chest tightened, the weight of every regret, every almost, every what-if pressing down on me. I started. But the other me shook their head. "No one does." I reached out, my hand hovering over the book, and then I stopped. "No," I said, stepping back. "No, I can't." The other me raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because it's not real," I said, my voice firm now. "None of this is. The life I have, the choices I've made, they're mine, and I don't want to lose that, even if it's messy." The other me studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Wise," they said, closing the book. The room faded, the firelight dimming until there was nothing but darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment. The phone was silent, the mirror empty, but I felt lighter, as though I'd let go of something I didn't even know I was carrying. It began with a window, or rather, the sound of the window. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at exactly 3:07 a.m., like someone, or something, was politely asking to come inside. Now, I've read enough horror stories to know that nothing good ever starts with mysterious tapping in the middle of the night. So I did what any sane person would do. I ignored it. I burrowed under the blankets like a terrified possum and willed myself to sleep. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew more persistent, like the window itself had gotten impatient with me. I sighed. Fine. I told myself it was probably just a branch, or maybe a bird with bad life decisions. Not a ghost, not a ghoul, not an eldritch horror politely knocking at my suburban apartment window. I climbed out of bed, wrapped in the kind of blanket cape that makes you feel slightly braver than you actually are, and tiptoed to the window. The room was pitch dark except for the faint orange glow of a distant streetlight, which did not help with the horror movie atmosphere. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There was no wind. The trees were perfectly still outside, which immediately ruled out branches and birds. My heart did that weird thud-thud-thud thing it does when your brain goes, "Well, buddy, this is where we die." And then I saw it. There, perched neatly on the windowsill, was a shoe. A single, slightly muddy sneaker. I blinked. It wasn't tapping now, just sitting there, staring at me. Or at least, it felt like it was staring. I opened the window as little as possible, just enough to reach out and grab it, half expecting it to bite me. It didn't. It was just a shoe. Left foot, size 10, with laces that had seen better days. I stood there in the dark, holding this abandoned sneaker, baffled. Now, a normal person would have shrugged and gone back to bed. But the thing about me is I can't let weird things go. The second something doesn't make sense, My brain gets hooked like a fish and won't let up until I've reeled it all the way in. So, I did what no one in their right mind would do at 3 a.m. I put the shoe down, grabbed my flashlight, and went outside. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that makes everything feel sharper, like the whole world is holding its breath. I shivered as I scanned the ground around my window with the flashlight, half expecting to find the rest of a dismembered person. Instead, I found another shoe. Right foot, same size. It was a few feet away, just lying in the grass like it had been left there in a hurry. What is happening? I whispered to myself, flashlight beam wobbling in my hand. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but visible in the dew-covered grass. 2 human footprints leading away from the shoes, toward the tree line at the edge of the property. My first thought was, well, that's how people die in movies, but my second thought was, I have to know. I followed the prints, carefully, flashlight sweeping back and forth like I was in an episode of some poorly written true crime show. The prints stopped at the base of an enormous tree, one of those ancient, gnarled oaks with roots that twist up from the ground like veins. And there, nestled in the hollow between 2 roots, was something even stranger. A perfectly folded pair of jeans and a neatly stacked sweatshirt. It was like someone had simply stepped out of their clothes and vanished. At this point, my brain was going full panic mode. Who leaves a full set of clothes, perfectly folded, at the base of a tree? Did they evaporate? Were they abducted by aliens? Was this some bizarre prank? I crouched down, poking the clothes with my flashlight like they might explode. They didn't. But that didn't make me feel any better. And then I heard it, the tapping. But it wasn't coming from my window anymore. It was coming from above me. I froze. Slowly, I tilted my head back, flashlight beam climbing the trunk of the tree until it hit something dangling from a branch. It was a wind chime. A wind chime made of spoons. I don't know why that's the detail that broke me, but it was. I stood there, staring up at a spoon wind chime swaying ever so slightly in the still air, and started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was too much. The shoes, the folded clothes, and now the spoons. I felt like I had stumbled into a strange alternate reality designed specifically to mess with me. Okay, I said out loud to nobody. You win. Whatever this is, you win. I backed away, leaving the shoes, the clothes, and the spoons behind. I walked straight back to my apartment, locked the door, and left the muddy sneakers on my porch like a peace offering to whatever weird forces were at work. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the window, I half convinced myself it had all been a dream. But when I opened the door, the shoes were still there, both of them, sitting side by side as if nothing had happened. The wind chime was gone. The footprints? Gone. I don't know if someone came back for the clothes, the shoes, or the spoons, but I wasn't about to follow up. I threw the sneakers into a box, labeled it, Weird Things I Don't Understand, and shoved it in the back of my closet. Every now and then, I'll hear a faint tap, tap, tap at my window late at night, and I tell myself it's just the wind, or a bird, or anything that makes more sense than a pair of abandoned shoes and a wind chime made of spoons. So now I have to ask, have you ever found something so strange you couldn't explain it, but it stuck with you anyway? Or is it just me, out here collecting haunted shoes? This morning, the rain was falling up. I noticed it first when I heard an unfamiliar patter against the roof, like someone tapping from the wrong side of the ceiling. I got up, pulled back the curtains, and sure enough, thousands of droplets were drifting lazily upward, lifting themselves from the sidewalk, the trees, the windows. Puddles unwound like ribbons, pulling themselves into the sky where they vanished into low, dark clouds hanging far too close to the ground. A man across the street held his umbrella upside down, collecting water like he was planning to keep it. He glanced up, saw me watching, and gave me a polite nod before continuing on his way, the puddle in his umbrella swirling like a restless storm. The toaster was crying when I walked into the kitchen. Tears, actual, metallic tears, slid down its chrome surface, pooling onto the countertop. "What's wrong with you?" I asked. "Too much bread," it said between sniffles. "You keep shoving bread into me, and I think I've reached my limit." I stared at it, mid-yawn, coffee in hand. I thought you liked making toast. I did. Once. But I need time to reflect. To grow. I sighed and picked up a banana instead, which promptly shivered in my hand. Put me down, it whispered. What? I'm not ripe for this, the banana said dramatically, peeling itself slightly before snapping shut like a trap. Don't eat me. I placed it back in the bowl and backed away, deciding to skip breakfast altogether. Outside, the air felt unusually thin, like it had been stretched out to accommodate something much larger than itself. I stepped onto the porch and watched as the world unfolded. Buildings swayed gently, as though they were breathing. A lamppost wandered slowly up the street, muttering to itself, its light blinking in time with each step. Cars floated by without drivers, bobbing like forgotten balloons. A child across the street tied a leash around the neck of a cloud and tugged it forward, laughing as it drifted obediently behind her. At the corner, a street vendor had set up a table full of clocks. Not just any clocks. These were alive, their hands twitching nervously, their faces blinking open and shut like they were thinking. Time for sale, the vendor shouted, holding up a clock with a frame made of blue glass. Buy an hour, trade a minute, steal back a year. I approached the table cautiously. What's the catch? The vendor, an elderly man with skin like parchment and eyes that reflected too many stars, smiled broadly. The catch is deciding what you can afford to lose. I picked up a small silver pocket watch. It ticked in reverse, soft and soothing. What's this one? A forgotten hour, he said. One that slipped away when you weren't looking. I held it up to my ear, listening to the sound of something familiar. It felt like a summer afternoon, drowsy and golden, the kind of hour where nothing happens but everything feels perfect. What would it cost me? The vendor squinted at me, tilting his head. One memory. Nothing too valuable, just a moment you don't need anymore. What if I don't want to forget anything? Suit yourself, he said, shrugging, though there was something sad in his smile. I put the watch down and walked on, the clocks murmuring softly behind me. The park was stranger than usual. The trees had decided to go for a walk, their roots lifting gently out of the ground as they strolled around the pond. The pond itself wasn't water anymore, but liquid mirror, rippling faintly as birds dipped their wings into it, leaving streaks of silver in the air. A man sat at a bench nearby, sketching something that didn't exist yet, a bridge made of light, arching over nothing. Nice day, I said as I passed. Not finished yet, he replied without looking up. A path appeared at the edge of the park that hadn't been there before. It curved sharply and shimmered, as though made of tightly woven threads of moonlight. I glanced around, half expecting someone to tell me not to take it, but no one seemed to care. The path hummed faintly under my feet as I stepped onto it. It led me to a door standing alone in a clearing. The door was painted deep red, its surface smooth and warm, like it had been touched by thousands of hands. There was no wall, no house, just the door. I knew, instinctively, that this was the kind of door you couldn't turn away from once you saw it. I knocked. Come in, said a voice. I opened the door and stepped through. On the other side was a train station. Not the kind you'd find in the real world. This one was impossible. The tracks didn't sit on the ground but hung in the air, spiraling upward in impossible loops before disappearing into the clouds. Trains floated gently along them like fish swimming through invisible water. People, if they were people, waited on platforms, their bodies shimmering like heat waves, faces blank but kind. A conductor appeared beside me, wearing a hat that seemed to swallow light. Where to? He asked. I don't know, I replied honestly. He nodded, as though this made perfect sense. The best destinations are the ones you don't choose. He handed me a ticket, and I glanced down to read it. Instead of a location, the ticket said, "You'll know when you arrive." I stepped onto the nearest train. Inside, the seats were empty except for a small cat curled up on a velvet cushion. It looked up as I sat down, its eyes reflecting the entire universe. Planets spinning, stars collapsing, galaxies blooming into being. Long journey? I asked it. The cat blinked slowly, purring. Long enough. The train began to move, the windows filling with sights I couldn't comprehend. Cities folded and unfolded like origami. Oceans rose into the sky, carrying ships that sailed among constellations. A mountain turned itself inside out, revealing a hollow core filled with light. The landscape wasn't shifting so much as rearranging itself, like the world was flipping through options, trying to decide what to be. Eventually, the train slowed. The cat stretched, yawned, and hopped off its cushion, disappearing through a door that hadn't been there before. My ticket began to hum softly in my hand, growing warmer, and I knew it was time to leave. I stepped off the train and onto solid ground. It took me a moment to realize where I was. My living room. The furniture was back in its proper place, the walls steady, the ceiling behaving. The rain was no longer falling up, though the window still held the faint shimmer of something unnatural. My alarm clock sat on the nightstand, whole and silent. On the table was the ticket, now blank. I picked it up and held it to the light, searching for answers, but it crumbled softly in my hands, turning into dust that glittered like stardust before disappearing altogether. I stood there, the quiet pressing in around me. Then, faintly, I heard the purr of the cat somewhere far away, a sound that seemed to say, "You'll know when you arrive."